Here's something nobody tells you. That thing you do every night, closing your eyes for 8 straight hours, believing it's natural, believing it's how humans have always slept, believing your body simply demands this specific rhythm. It's mostly a lie, not a biological truth. A story written by factory whistles, alarm clocks, and the economic needs of industrialized nations that needed workers awake at precisely the same time every morning. The 8-hour sleep isn't ancient wisdom coded into your DNA. It's about 150 years old, younger than the light bulb, younger than the telephone, and for most of human history, sleeping this way would have seemed bizarre, even dangerous. This script is going to take you through 3 threads that tangle together into something almost nobody talks about. First, there's a lost architecture of sleep, a completely different way our ancestors spent their nights for hundreds of thousands of years, a pattern so normal that medieval doctors recommended it, so universal that languages had specific words for it, so natural that when you wake at 2 a.m. and can't fall back asleep, you're not broken. You're experiencing an echo of how humans slept before modernity tried to fix us. Second, there's the moment when sleep became genuinely dangerous in a new way. Not because of predators stalking outside your cave, that's the old danger we'll get to, but because we built a world that punishes sleep. A 24-hour society where exhausted tanker captains run ships onto reefs, where surgeons operate on their 28th straight hour, where nuclear plant operators nod off at control panels. The cost has been measured in oil spills, in plane crashes, in body counts. And third, the science that's been quietly accumulating for decades suggests that 8 hours might not even be the right number. That mortality data, the actual statistical relationship between how long you sleep and how long you live, tells a more complicated story than the one you've been sold. But let me paint you a picture first, because this is what makes it real. It's 1350. You're lying in a house somewhere in England or France or Germany. No electricity, obviously, no streetlights. The darkness outside isn't the diluted darkness of a modern suburb where light pollution turns the sky orange. This is complete, profound, almost physical darkness. The kind that presses against your windows. You went to bed maybe 3 hours after sunset, whenever your body felt heavy and the work was done. Now you're awake, fully awake. It's sometime after midnight. You can't check, because clocks that could tell you the hour don't exist in most homes yet. But you're not anxious. You're not reaching for pills or scrolling through your phone wondering what's wrong with you. This is first sleep ending. First, this waking is expected, normal, planned for. Maybe you get up and check the fire, add wood if it's cold. Maybe you pray, because the religious texts of the era specifically mention prayers suited for this hour. Maybe you talk quietly with your spouse. Maybe you just lie there, thinking, letting your mind drift through problems and memories in a way that the frantic daylight hours never allow. Historical records mention this time as uniquely suited for reflection, for intimacy, for the kind of deep thought that needs darkness and silence. Then, after an hour, maybe 2, you feel sleep returning. You slip back into what the same historical sources called second sleep, and you stay there until dawn, or work, or children or animals demand your attention. This wasn't insomnia. This was life, for most of human existence. If you're listening to this right now, I'm curious. Where are you and what time is it? Comment below, because I check these and it's wild. Berlin at breakfast, Boston at bedtime, Bangkok in the afternoon, all listening to the same story about sleep. It's like we're all trying to figure out what we've lost. The 8-hour myth didn't replace this pattern because science proved it was better. It replaced it because factories needed shift workers who showed up at 6 a.m. sharp. Because schools needed children in rows at 8. Because an industrializing world needed synchronized schedules more than it needed human biology. And in that transformation, something almost killed us. Not almost killed us as a species, like that bottleneck 900,000 years ago, but almost killed us in specific, preventable, utterly tragic ways that we're still counting the cost of. March 24th, 1989, just after midnight, the Exxon Valdez, a supertanker longer than 3 football fields, loaded with 53 million gallons of crude oil, runs hard aground on Bligh Reef in Alaska's Prince William Sound. The third mate at the helm had been awake for 18 hours. The captain was asleep, possibly drunk. Investigators later said fatigue was a direct contributing factor. 10.8 million gallons of oil spilled into some of the most pristine waters on Earth. Over 1,300 miles of coastline poisoned. Hundreds of thousands of seabirds dead. An entire ecosystem devastated. Because someone was too tired to steer straight. That's not ancient history. That's the cost of pretending humans can operate on schedules that ignore what we actually need. And it's just one example. We'll come back to this. To Chernobyl's 1:23 a.m. meltdown. To medical errors in the pre-dawn hours. To all the ways our war against sleep has struck back. But first we need to go back. Way back. Before the 8-hour lie, before clocks and factories, before even houses and fire. We need to understand how humans actually slept when survival was the only schedule that mattered. Here's the thing about asking how humans slept for 300,000 years. The answer is, not like you do. For the vast sweep of our species' existence, there were no clocks, no alarm bells, no shift schedules or school start times or meetings at 9 sharp. There was sunrise, sunset, the phases of the moon, and the rhythm of seasons. That's it. And within those constraints, sleep was shockingly flexible, shockingly variable, nothing like the rigid 8-hour block we've convinced ourselves is natural law. The best window we have into this lost world comes from people still living without electricity. Researchers have spent years studying contemporary hunter-gatherer groups, the Hadza in Tanzania, the San in Namibia, the Tsimane in Bolivia, strapping actigraphy monitors to their wrists to track actual sleep patterns in environments that approximate how our ancestors lived. And what they found surprised everyone. These people, living without artificial light, without smartphones or Netflix or any of the things we blame for our sleep problems, they sleep about 6.5 hours a night on average. Not 10, not 12. Some nights 5.7 hours, some nights 7.1, averaging around 6.4. They fall asleep roughly 3 hours after sunset, not immediately when darkness falls. They wake about an hour before sunrise, and their sleep changes with the seasons. Longer in winter, shorter in summer, not because of daylight hours alone, but because of temperature. Temperature. That's the variable nobody talks about. These groups tend to fall asleep when the air starts cooling down after sunset and wake when it reaches its coldest point just before dawn. The environment isn't just setting their schedule, it's regulating it directly through thermal cues that modern climate-controlled bedrooms have completely erased. But here's where it gets interesting. These patterns aren't uniform, aren't rigid. Some groups show a consolidated night sleep plus short naps during the brutal midday heat. Others show something closer to the segmented pattern we just talked about, a main sleep period, a brief wake around midnight, then a second sleep until dawn. The Hadza in particular often have people awake at different times throughout the night, which makes sense. If everyone's unconscious simultaneously, who's watching for predators? Who's keeping the fire going? Who's listening for danger? This variability isn't a bug, it's a feature. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived in small groups, maybe 20 to 50 people, moving with game and seasons, sleeping in temporary shelters or under open sky, always vulnerable. Under those conditions, a sleep pattern that kept some portion of the group lightly alert at staggered intervals would have provided enormous survival value. Anthropologists studying traditional societies find this pattern repeated again and again. a rotating watch system built not into formal duties, but into the natural variation of when different people feel sleepy. And when you compare modern humans to our primate relatives, something else becomes clear. We sleep less than they do, but better. Chimps sleep 10 to 17 hours depending on the species and age. Gorillas can rack up 12 to 14. Most primates are sleeping more than half their lives away. Humans clock in around 7 to 8 hours, often less. Yet we spend a much higher percentage of that time in REM sleep, in deep, slow-wave sleep, in the restorative stages that actually matter. The leading theory for why comes down to real estate. Our ancestors moved from sleeping in trees to sleeping on the ground. That's a huge shift in vulnerability. In a tree, you're relatively safe, uncomfortable, but protected. You can afford to sleep long and light, dozing through extended periods without deep commitment to unconsciousness. On the ground, especially once you've got fire and a social group around you, you're more secure from predators but more exposed to everything else. Cold, weather, the risk that your fire goes out and suddenly you're back to being prey. Under those conditions, natural selection favored efficiency. Sleep less, but sleep deeper. Get the neurological restoration you need in fewer hours so you're not lying there unconscious and exposed any longer than necessary. Quality over quantity, depth over duration. This is the evolutionary trade-off that shaped human sleep architecture, and it's why we're capable of functioning on 7 hours while other primates would be wrecks. But it gets more complicated when you look at cultures that kept more traditional patterns into the modern era. Mediterranean siestas, Latin American midday rests, similar practices across the Middle East, South Asia, East Asia. These aren't lazy cultural quirks, they're adaptations. In hot climates, working through the brutal midday heat is inefficient and dangerous. So you compress your nighttime sleep slightly, rise early while it's cool, work, then take an hour or 90-minute nap during the hottest part of the day. Biphasic sleep, 2 distinct periods, adding up to roughly the same total as monophasic sleep but distributed in a way that matches both human biology and environmental reality. Even in groups that do have electricity, researchers find that access to artificial light pushes bedtime later by about an hour and cuts total sleep by 40 to 60 minutes compared to neighbouring groups still living by firelight and moonlight. This tells us something crucial. For most of human history, darkness constrained when you could sleep, but it didn't standardise it. Fire extended the evening somewhat, allowed for social time after sunset, but it wasn't bright enough or cheap enough to truly conquer the night. Sleep timing was flexible within natural limits, responsive to temperature, season, workload, social dynamics. There was no correct way to sleep, no pathological deviation. If you woke in the night, it wasn't insomnia requiring treatment. If you napped at midday, it wasn't laziness requiring correction. If you slept longer in winter and shorter in summer, that wasn't a disorder. It was just being human in an environment that shaped you as much as you shaped it. The 8-hour consolidated block we treat as normal, as natural, as the standard against which all deviation is measured. That's the anomaly. That's the weird modern experiment we've been running for maybe 5 or 6 generations. Before that, for 3,000 centuries, humans slept in patterns as varied as the environments they inhabited, as flexible as the survival challenges they faced. And then everything changed. The evidence sits in dusty archives across Europe. Diaries, court records, medical treatises, prayer books, literature spanning 3 centuries, and buried in those documents, appearing again and again in languages from English to French to Italian to Latin, are 2 phrases that modern readers keep stumbling over. First sleep and second sleep, not metaphors, not poetic expressions. Matter-of-fact references to something everyone simply understood. The night had architecture, and we've completely forgotten what it looked like. Historian Roger E. Kirsch spent 16 years tracking down these references, eventually collecting over 500 documentary mentions of segmented sleep from roughly 1500 to 1800. What emerges from his research is a picture of pre-industrial European nights that looks nothing like ours. People didn't go to bed and sleep straight through until morning. They went to bed a few hours after dusk, slept for 3 or 4 hours, woke up, and stayed awake for 1 to 3 hours in the middle of the night. Then they went back to sleep for another 3 or 4 hours until dawn. This wasn't insomnia. This wasn't a sleep disorder. This was just how the night worked. The interval between first sleep and second sleep had a name, the watch, and people used it for everything. Quiet, domestic activities that fit the liminal space between deep unconsciousness and the demands of daylight. You'd wake naturally, not startled or anxious, just gently surfacing into darkness. Maybe your partner was already awake. Maybe you were alone for a while. The most common activity was tending the fire. In winter, a fire left unattended for 8 hours would die, and starting one from scratch in the middle of the night was miserable work. So you'd wake, add fuel, make sure the embers stayed alive until morning. Practical, necessary, built into the rhythm of survival. But people did far more than maintain fires. Prayer books from the period include specific prayers meant for the watch, nighttime devotions structured around the assumption that you'd be awake and contemplative somewhere around midnight. Some texts specifically instructed the faithful to use the time between sleeps for spiritual reflection, treating it as a natural opportunity for communion with God, when the world was quiet and the mind was clear but not yet dulled by exhaustion. Sex. Medical texts from the era recommended it explicitly. After first sleep, they said. That's when conception was most likely, when the body was rested but not sluggish, when desire was strongest. Some physicians wrote detailed advice about timing intercourse to the interval between sleeps, treating it as common knowledge that this was when couples would be most fertile and most satisfied. The watch wasn't just tolerated, it was medicalized, woven into expert recommendations about health and reproduction. People interpreted their dreams. The transition between first and second sleep often produced vivid, memorable dreams, and waking just after one meant the images were still fresh. Dream interpretation manuals from the period assumed you'd have time to lie in darkness thinking through what you'd just experienced, parsing symbolism, looking for meaning or warning. This wasn't fringe mysticism. This was ordinary domestic practice. Some got up and moved around, visited neighbours, smoked, did small chores that didn't require daylight. Court records mention crimes committed during the watch. Petty thefts and vandalism carried out by people who knew that a portion of the population would be awake but not fully alert, that this quiet hour offered cover for mischief. The fact that crime was specifically timed to the watch tells us it was predictable, regular enough that people could plan around it. And through all of this, the sources treat it as utterly normal. There's no hand-wringing about interrupted sleep. No anxiety about lying awake. The watch is just there, part of the night's structure, like sunset and dawn. A 16th century doctor writes casually about patients waking after their first sleep, as though this requires no explanation. A 17th century diarist notes he lay awake between sleeps thinking about a problem at work. An 18th century novel has characters meeting for conversation at the hour between sleeps. Mundane, unremarkable, the texture of ordinary life. Now here's the thing about long winter nights in Northern Europe. Darkness could stretch 14, 15, 16 hours. Going to bed shortly after dusk and trying to sleep straight through until dawn would mean 10 or 12 hours of continuous unconsciousness. That's not restorative. That's excessive, impractical, probably impossible for most people. Your body doesn't want to be inert that long. You'd wake up stiff, groggy, needing to urinate, uncomfortable, Segmented sleep solved this problem elegantly. You'd retire early because there wasn't much else to do in the dark, sleep your first block, wake naturally for an hour or two of quiet activity, then return to bed for a second. Shorter sleep that carried you to dawn. Total sleep time might be 7 or 8 hours, but it was distributed in a way that matched both the constraints of the season and the limits of human physiology. You weren't fighting your body's signals, you were working with them, and the pattern shows up across classes. Ekirch finds references among nobles and peasants, urban merchants and rural labourers. The wealthy might spend their watch reading by candlelight or in intimate conversation. The poor might use it to check on livestock or mend clothes by firelight. The activities varied with resources, but the underlying rhythm seems to have been widespread, at least among literate Europeans whose records survived. That's the caveat worth acknowledging. Most of what we know comes from people who could write or afford to have their lives documented. Diaries, medical texts, court records, all skew toward the educated and the propertied. We have hints of similar patterns elsewhere. The Tiv people in Nigeria use terms translating to first sleep and second sleep as markers of nighttime, but whether the practice was truly universal or heavily concentrated in certain regions and social contexts is still debated. Some historians push back on Ekirch's claims of ubiquity, arguing the evidence is thinner and more variable than the narrative suggests. But here's what makes the segmented sleep theory compelling beyond the documentary record. In the 1990s, psychiatrist Thomas Ware ran an experiment. He took modern subjects and put them in conditions mimicking pre-industrial winter nights. 14 hours of darkness per day, no artificial light, no clocks, no external time cues. Just darkness from early evening to late morning, like February in London circa 1650. For the first few weeks, the subjects slept long, consolidated blocks, catching up on modern sleep debt. But after a month, something shifted. They began sleeping in 2 distinct periods, 4 hours, then waking naturally for 1 to 3 hours of quiet wakefulness, then another 3 to 4 hours of sleep. Spontaneously, without instruction, their bodies, freed from electric light and social schedules, drifted into the same pattern Ekirch had found in centuries-old documents. During the waking interval, subjects reported a kind of meditative calm, a state of consciousness they described as peaceful and contemplative, not anxious, not trying to force themselves back to sleep, just lying quietly, thinking, experiencing what one participant called an altered state somewhere between waking and dreaming. It was, they said, unlike anything they experienced in normal modern life. This suggests something profound. Segmented sleep might not be a cultural quirk or a response to specific historical conditions. It might be a natural human pattern, one that emerges when we remove the environmental constraints, the electric lights and alarm clocks and work schedules that force us into consolidated sleep. The architecture of the night that Ekirch found in archives might simply be what human sleep looks like when we let it unfold according to its own internal logic instead of external demands. But by the time Ware ran his experiment, segmented sleep had already vanished from lived experience. The watch had become insomnia. The interval between sleeps had become a pathology requiring treatment, and the transformation happened so completely that when Ekirch first published his findings, most readers thought he'd uncovered some bizarre historical anomaly, rather than a lost human universal. What happened? How did we forget the architecture of the night so thoroughly that waking at midnight became a medical problem instead of a natural rhythm? The answer involves candles, gas lamps, coffee houses, and the systematic conquest of darkness by artificial light. But it starts earlier than you'd think, and the consequences were darker than anyone intended. But there's something crucial we need to understand about that interval between sleeps, about why people developed this pattern in the first place. It wasn't just about matching sleep to the length of winter nights or finding time for prayer and intimacy. There was a darker, more primal reason. Sleep. True, deep sleep. The kind where you're completely unconscious and vulnerable was dangerous, potentially lethal, and your ancestors knew it. Picture a medieval English village. Timber frame houses packed close together, thatch roofs overhead, walls made of wattle and daub that would burn like kindling. Inside each house, an open hearth on a dirt or wooden floor. No chimney, just a hole in the roof to let smoke escape. Rushes or dried herbs scattered on the ground for insulation and scent. Wool blankets, linen clothing, everything flammable. And in the centre of it all, a fire that needed to burn all night because winter in northern Europe would kill you just as surely as any predator. Now imagine everyone in the house falling into deep, uninterrupted sleep for 8 straight hours. A log rolls, a spark jumps, lands in the rushes or catches the edge of a blanket, smoulders for minutes, maybe an hour, then ignites. By the time anyone wakes, flames are climbing the walls and there's no way out. Everyone dies. The fire spreads to neighbouring houses. Half the village burns before dawn. This wasn't theoretical. This was the nightmare that shaped medieval life. Fire killed more people in pre-modern Europe than plague in many years, and most of those fires started at night when families were sleeping. The danger was so omnipresent, so catastrophic, that it became embedded in law and language. The word curfew, it comes from Old French couvre-feu, literally cover fire. That's what it meant originally. Not a restriction on movement, though it became that later. It meant the evening bell that told every household bank their hearths, to cover the coals with ash so they'd smoulder safely through the night instead of throwing sparks while everyone slept. Starting in the 14th century, probably earlier in some places, English towns rang curfew bells at dusk. You'd hear it echo across the streets, 8 or 9 in the evening, and you knew what to do. Cover your fire, make it safe. Because unconsciousness was coming, and unconsciousness meant vulnerability. But people also knew that covering a fire meant it might die before morning, and restarting a fire from nothing in the middle of a freezing night was miserable, sometimes impossible. So the optimal strategy wasn't to smother the hearth completely and hope for the best. It was to wake up, tend it, add fuel, make sure it stayed alive but controlled. Then go back to sleep knowing you'd checked, knowing the house wouldn't burn down in the next few hours. The watch wasn't just a natural rhythm, it was a survival strategy. That interval between first and second sleep, when you'd wake naturally around midnight or 1 in the morning, that was your chance to verify that the fire hadn't killed you yet. You'd check the hearth, listen for sounds of trouble, make sure everything was secure. Only then would you let yourself slip back into deep sleep for the second cycle. And it wasn't just fire. Medieval and early modern towns organised elaborate night watch systems specifically because they understood that sleeping populations were vulnerable populations. Watchmen patrolled from around 9 or 10 at night until dawn, carrying lanterns, challenging anyone they found in the streets after curfew. They were looking for thieves, obviously, but also for fires. Watching for the first glow of flame, listening for screams, ready to raise the alarm before a spark became an inferno. Court records from the period show criminals timing their activities to the watch, the interval between sleeps. They knew that around midnight, a portion of the population would be awake but not fully alert, lying in darkness, not yet committed to second sleep. It was a window of opportunity. People were conscious enough to hear something and ignore it as ordinary night sounds, but not alert enough to respond quickly or organize resistance. Perfect conditions for burglary, vandalism, assault. The fact that crime was strategically timed to the watch tells us how predictable the pattern was. You couldn't plan around something random. Segmented sleep was regular enough, common enough, that criminals could build tactics around it, and night watchmen learned to patrol most carefully during those hours, knowing the population was at its most vulnerable. But the really interesting evidence comes from somewhere completely different. Tanzania. The Hadza people, one of the last remaining hunter-gatherer groups, living in conditions that might approximate how humans spent most of their evolutionary history. Researchers studying Hadza sleep patterns used actigraphy devices to track 33 adults over 20 consecutive days and nights. They wanted to know whether modern industrial sleep patterns, everyone unconscious for roughly the same 8-hour block, were universal or culturally specific. What they found was striking. During the entire study period, all adults were simultaneously asleep for only 18 minutes total, 18 minutes out of 20 days. For 99.8% of the night, at least one adult in the group was awake or in very light sleep. This wasn't planned. Nobody was organizing formal watches or assigning sentinel duty. It happened naturally, driven by variation in chronotypes, some people naturally night owls, others extreme morning types, and age-related differences in sleep architecture. Older Hadza adults slept more lightly and fragmented, waking frequently. Younger adults had deeper, more consolidated sleep but at different times. The pattern emerged from biology and individual variation, creating what researchers called an unconscious sentinel system. The evolutionary logic is compelling. Deep sleep is restorative, necessary, non-negotiable, but it's also dangerous. You can't respond to threats, can't flee from predators, can't fight off attackers, can't notice fire or flood or any environmental hazard until it's too late. Any population that regularly fell into complete collective unconsciousness would be easy prey. So humans seem to have evolved a solution: variation. Stagger the sleep timing across a group so that someone is always at least partially awake. Mix chronotypes. Have enough people whose sleep is light or fragmented that the odds of everyone being simultaneously unconscious drop to nearly zero. Create through genetics and age structure a rotating vigilance system that never formally organizes but always functions. Sailors knew this instinctively. They didn't invent rotating watch shifts because someone thought it would be a good idea. They did it because everyone sleeping at once on a ship was suicide. Weather changes. The vessel drifts off course. Equipment fails. Someone had to be awake, always, and human biology provided the template. Stagger the timing, break sleep into manageable chunks, accept that complete uninterrupted rest is a luxury you can't afford when the environment punishes unconsciousness. Military forces figured it out too. Sentinels, perimeter guards, rotating duty so that the camp was never completely vulnerable. Some of this was formal organization, sure, but it also worked because humans are built for it. We can function on broken sleep if we have to. Our sleep architecture adapts. We don't collapse after one interrupted night because our ancestors who couldn't handle fragmented sleep died before reproducing. This is the first way sleep nearly killed us. Not because we didn't get enough of it, but because we needed it at all. The biological imperative for unconsciousness, several hours every night where we're helpless and unresponsive, that was the vulnerability. And everything, segmented sleep, sentinel patterns, curfew bells, night watches, all of it was humanity trying to mitigate an unavoidable biological risk. Complete, deep, uninterrupted 8-hour sleep. That was never the norm. That was a luxury most humans throughout history could not safely afford. You slept when you could, as deeply as you dared, and you woke up periodically to make sure the night hadn't killed you yet. Then you covered your fire, listened to the darkness, and trusted that you'd make it to dawn. Most nights you did. But the fear never fully left, because unconsciousness, in a world without electric lights and burglar alarms and fire departments, wasn't rest. It was a calculated gamble you took every single night. Then something changed. Not overnight, not everywhere at once, but slowly. Over the course of 2 centuries, humanity began dismantling the architecture of darkness that had governed our nights for 300,000 years. It started with tallow, rendered animal fat, moulded around a wick, burned to produce light. Tallow candles had existed for millennia, but they were expensive enough that most households used them sparingly. The poor relied on rushlights, literally reeds soaked in fat that burned for maybe 20 minutes and produced light roughly equivalent to holding up a cigarette. Smoky, dim, pathetic. But it was light, and light meant you could extend your waking hours past sunset, at least briefly. Beeswax was better, much better, producing brighter, cleaner flame. But it was a luxury product, monopolised by churches and the very wealthy. In Britain, the government taxed candles starting in 1709, deliberately keeping artificial light expensive, keeping the night dark for everyone except those who could afford to buy their way out of biological rhythms that had governed human existence since the species emerged. But by the late 18th century, technology was catching up to demand. Oil lamps improved dramatically. The Argand lamp, developed in the 1780s, used a hollow circular wick and a glass chimney to produce flame intensity equivalent to about 10 ordinary candles. Suddenly, if you could afford whale oil or refined vegetable oils, you could turn your parlour into something approaching daylight. Not quite, not really, but enough that reading, sewing, detailed work became feasible for hours after sunset. This was the first crack in the wall. Wealthy households began treating evening as a second day. Dinner moved later. Social gatherings extended past 9, past 10 at night. Coffee houses in London and Paris stayed open, lit by dozens of oil lamps, creating spaces where men, mostly men, could meet, talk, conduct business well into the night. The traditional pattern, early to bed because darkness left no alternative, started eroding among those who could afford to fight it. But oil was still expensive. Lamps required constant maintenance, and the light, while better than candles, was still weak by modern standards. Most people, the vast majority of the population, still went to bed when darkness fell and woke when light returned. The night still belonged to biology. Then came gas, and gas changed everything. The first gas street lighting appeared in London around 1813, Westminster Bridge glowing with manufactured flame bright enough to read by. Baltimore became the first American city lit by gas in 1816. By 1823, London had roughly 40,000 gas street lamps, covering over 200 miles of streets. By 1880, that number had exploded to about 1 million lamps. The city had killed its darkness. The efficiency was staggering. A single gas mantle could produce 12 times the light of a candle or oil lamp, while costing about 75% less to operate. This wasn't incremental improvement. This was a revolution. For the first time in human history, bright light became cheap enough that middle-class businesses and eventually ordinary households could afford to flood their spaces with artificial illumination for hours every night. And they did. Theatres stayed open later, performances running past midnight. Shops extended their hours, gaslights blazing in windows to attract customers who no longer needed to rush home before dark. Museums, restaurants, oyster houses, entertainment venues, all of them colonizing the night, creating a commercial and social infrastructure that competed directly with sleep. The cultural shift happened faster than anyone expected. By the mid-19th century, major European and American cities had developed genuine nightlife. Not the furtive, dangerous, torch-lit gatherings of earlier centuries, but legitimate evening culture. Middle-class families attended late concerts. Workers stopped at gaslit pubs after shifts that now ran past sunset because factories had gas lighting too, extending productive hours far beyond what candlelight had ever allowed. And the watch, that interval between first and second sleep, started shrinking. When your evening entertainment doesn't end until 11 at night, you don't fall into first sleep at 9. You stay up, you participate, you push bedtime later and later, and when you finally do sleep, you're exhausted enough that you drop into deep unconsciousness and stay there. Or try to, because morning arrives just as early, and now you've got maybe 6 hours instead of the 8 or 9 you might have gotten in 2 separate chunks. The historical record captures this transition in real time. References to first sleep and second sleep, abundant in European texts before 1700, began declining sharply through the 18th century. By the late 19th century, they'd largely vanished. Medical texts stopped mentioning the watch as a normal feature of healthy sleep. Legal documents stopped timing events to it. Literature stopped using it as a narrative device. The cultural memory of segmented sleep was being actively erased, replaced by a new expectation. One long continuous block of unconsciousness, preferably 8 hours, preferably without waking. Roger Kirch, the historian who's done the most extensive work on this, argues that artificial lighting didn't just make the shift possible, it made it inevitable. Once you could cheaply illuminate the night, once evening hours became valuable time rather than dead time, the economic and social pressure to compress sleep became overwhelming. Every hour you spent awake in the middle of the night, that old watch period, was an hour you weren't participating in the lit world. An hour you were wasting, and increasingly, an hour you couldn't afford to waste because morning arrived on a factory schedule, not whenever you naturally woke from second sleep. This was a class issue first, then a universal one. The wealthy adopted late-night socializing early, when only they could afford the light to enable it. But as gas became cheaper, and electric light even cheaper after that, the pattern trickled down. Working-class families might not host evening salons, but they lived in cities lit by gas street lamps, worked in factories lit by gas or electric fixtures, and faced the same pressure to synchronize their sleep to industrial schedules that didn't care about first sleep or second sleep or any sleep, except the minimal amount that would keep workers functional. The poor followed the rich into consolidated sleep, not because it was better, not because it was more natural, but because the economic system demanded it. Fixed wake times regardless of sunrise, shift work organized around clock time, not biological time, school starting at 8 in the morning whether or not children had slept enough or slept well. The entire social apparatus of modernity was being built on a foundation that assumed humans should sleep once, in one block, timed to a schedule, rather than responding to darkness and light and their own internal rhythms. Laboratory research has since suggested what might have happened if we'd kept the darkness. In the 1990s, the National Institute of Mental Health ran an experiment where subjects spent 14 hours each day in complete darkness, far longer than natural night, but enough to remove artificial lighting as a variable. They drifted almost immediately into biphasic sleep, 4 hours, then waking, then another 3 or 4 hours. The pattern emerged spontaneously without instruction, suggesting that segmented sleep might be our natural default when light doesn't interfere. But light had interfered, comprehensively. Artificially lit evenings compressed the night, pushed bedtime later, and left no room for waking intervals that no longer served any function in a world where fires were contained in stoves, where police patrolled lit streets, where the dangers of unconsciousness had been engineered away. We'd killed the darkness, and in killing it, we'd killed a sleep pattern that had governed human existence for longer than we'd been human. The question we never asked, because nobody remembered there'd been an alternative, was whether this was progress or just a very successful adaptation to a fundamentally altered environment. and what we'd lost in the trade. The answer, when it finally arrived, didn't come from doctors or scientists. It came from a bell, not a church bell calling people to prayer, a factory bell calling them to work. In the early industrial age, time stopped being something you lived inside of and started being something that lived outside of you, hanging on a wall, ticking in metal. For most of human history, work had been shaped by tasks and seasons. You ploughed when the soil was ready, harvested when the grain said it was time, stopped when it was too dark to see your own hand. There were busy seasons and slack ones, long summer days and shorter winter ones. Your body, the sun, and the work itself negotiated the schedule. Factories killed that negotiation. When steam engines and textile mills began to spread through Britain in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, they brought something new, machines that had to run continuously to be profitable. A loom didn't care if the sun was up. A steam engine didn't get tired. Investors who'd just poured money into brick and iron didn't want their capital sleeping. So they imposed a different kind of order. Factory owners mounted big, precise mechanical clocks on their walls, synchronized to city time rather than sunrise. They rang bells at 5 a.m., 6 a.m., whatever they chose, and if you weren't at your station when the bell stopped ringing, you were late. Be late too often, and you were fired. Historians call this time discipline. Before industrialization, being late meant missing a meeting with other humans who could wait or reschedule. After industrialization, being late meant being out of sync with a machine that never forgave and never stopped. The bell didn't negotiate, it dictated. Workdays in this new regime were brutal. 10 hours was considered moderate, 12, 14, 16 hours were not unusual, especially in the early decades. Children in British cotton mills could legally be worked up to 12 hours a day between 5 a.m. and 9 p.m. under the 1819 Cotton Mills and Factories Act, a law that was astonishingly supposed to be a reform. Think about what that does to a human day. Even if you assume only 12 hours of work, add walking to and from the factory, eating, basic washing, perhaps a few minutes with family, and you're left with a thin remnant of time in which sleep has to fit. Not sleep in too luxurious segments, drifting in and out of dreams with a contemplative watch in between, just unconsciousness, forced into whatever narrow gap remains between the night shift ending and the morning bell. In the countryside, people could still to some extent bend their labour to the light. In industrial cities, the relationship reversed. The light, now gas and soon electric, bent itself around the factory. Gas lamps in mills and workshops eliminated the last excuse for ending the day at sunset. Night was no longer a natural boundary. It was a cost line on a ledger. Under those conditions, first and second sleep didn't just fade. They became impossible. If you have to stand at a loom at 6 in the morning, 6 days a week, and you're working until 7 or 8 at night, you don't have a middle-of-the-night leisure period. You collapse. Your entire night becomes a single desperate attempt to cram in enough unconsciousness to stay upright the next day. The old watch, that quiet span between sleeps when people used to pray, talk, have sex, or simply exist, would now fall exactly when you can least afford to be awake. So the industrial city did what industrial systems always do. It took a flexible, adaptive human rhythm and shaved it down until it fit the machine. But workers were not machines. Bodies broke, minds broke. There were accidents, maimings, early deaths, and slowly, painfully, people began to rebel, not just against low wages and dangerous conditions, but against the sheer duration of their waking obligation to the factory. In 1817, a Welsh mill owner and social reformer named Robert Owen gave the revolt its most enduring slogan: 8 hours labour, 8 hours recreation, 8 hours rest. It was not a scientific formula. Owen hadn't run controlled trials on optimal human sleep duration. It was a political demand, a vision of a world where the day was carved into 3 equal parts, instead of being swallowed almost entirely by work. The beauty of that slogan was its symmetry. 24 hours divided cleanly into 3. It was memorable, chantable, easy to print on banners, and it captured something workers had begun to feel viscerally, that their days were unnaturally lopsided, that factories had stretched wakefulness past what any sane creature should endure. For decades that dream remained mostly that, a dream. Agitation for the 8-hour day ran headlong into employer resistance. In Britain, compromise measures like the 1847 10 Hours Act limited women and young people in textile mills to only 10 hours a day. It was an improvement, but still a far cry from Owen's elegant 888 division. Elsewhere, movements rose and were crushed. Strikes were broken. Demonstrations turned violent. People died under banners that demanded not revolution, not the overthrow of capitalism itself, but simply fewer hours at the machine. Slowly, though, the cracks widened. Around the world, especially after the social upheavals of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, governments began to write shorter days into law. In the United States, the Adamson Act of 1916 established an 8-hour day for interstate railroad workers, a critical precedent. After World War I, countries like Germany enshrined the 8-hour day and the 48-hour week as industrial standards. Unions fought, negotiated, threatened, and occasionally won. And as they did, something subtle happened. Owen's slogan had 3 parts: labour, recreation, rest. In theory, the rest was just that, time not controlled by the boss. It could include sleep, certainly, but also meals, conversation, child-rearing, reading, church, anything that wasn't wage work. The point was political autonomy, not sleep architecture. But when you carve the day into one big 8-hour work block and one big 8-hour not work block, before or after it, an obvious solution presents itself. Sleep all at once. Don't wake up in the middle of the night. Don't drift in and out. Don't maintain a flexible, seasonally adjusted, socially negotiated pattern. Slam your biological needs into a neat, consolidated package that fits cleanly beside your shift. Over time, the slogans 8 hours rest began to morph in the public imagination. It stopped sounding like a bargaining chip and started sounding like a prescription. 8 hours rest, 8 hours sleep. 8 hours is what you need. Not because anyone had demonstrated that humans naturally require that exact amount in one continuous block, but because that number happened to balance the industrial ledger. The rest of society followed suit. Schools, which had once fit more loosely around local agricultural or religious rhythms, were pulled into alignment with the factory day. Children were expected to rise early, arrive on time, and sit in regimented rows that mirrored workshop floors. Their parents' shifts dictated their own bedtimes, their own morning alarms. The train system, built to move goods and workers on precise timetables, reinforced a world where minutes mattered, and being out of sync was a punishable offence. Public institutions standardized their hours. Banks, post offices, courts, shops, all of them opened and closed according to clock time, not daylight. The entire social universe began to operate on synchronized mechanical schedules. If your job, your child's school, your transportation, and your ability to buy food all depend on you being awake during the same block of hours, then your sleep must retreat into the only remaining contiguous block, the night, unbroken, as long as possible. From the perspective of the system, this was a triumph of rationality. The day was orderly. The night was for rest. Everyone knew when they were supposed to be where. But from the perspective of human biology, something strange had occurred. A pattern that likely would have looked alien to your pre-industrial ancestors. A single, consolidated, 8-hour stretch of unconsciousness had been elevated to the status of normal, even natural, largely because it fit the needs of machines and markets. Medical thinking adjusted accordingly. Doctors in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, immersed in societies organized around the 8-hour day, began to talk about sleep in terms that assumed one long nightly block. Waking in the middle of the night, once so common that people had a word for the interval between sleeps, started to be pathologized. If you could not produce 8 unbroken hours of oblivion on demand, the problem was now in you, not in the schedule. The irony is hard to miss. The number that dominates our cultural imagination, 8 hours of sleep as some kind of gold standard, did not emerge from careful studies of hunter-gatherers or long-term experiments on human longevity. It emerged from factory floors, strike committees, and legislative compromises. It was a political ceiling on work that quietly hardened into a biological floor for rest. The factory bell, ringing across soot-darkened cities 2 centuries ago, didn't just tell people when to wake up. It began to tell them how to sleep. And we're still living inside that sound. By the time legislators were finally writing 8-hour days into law, another force was already creeping in that would make even that victory feel temporary. It arrived not as a bell, but as a bulb. Thomas Edison did not invent artificial light. People had been fighting the dark with fire for hundreds of thousands of years, with tallow dips and beeswax candles, with whale oil and gas jets. But all those earlier lights had 2 crucial limitations. They were expensive, and they were fragile. You didn't burn candles all night long for fun unless you were very rich. You didn't flood whole cities with gaslight without worrying about explosions and leaks. Edison's incandescent lamp promised something different. Cheap, controllable, apparently endless light at the flip of a switch. In 1879, when Edison publicly demonstrated his practical incandescent bulb, he wasn't just selling a gadget, he was selling a vision. In his world, darkness was not a natural rhythm, but a problem to be solved. Sleep, in his mind, was part of that problem. In interviews, he boasted that he only needed about 4 hours of sleep a night. He described sleep as a kind of waste, a thief of productive time. Later writers would quote him calling it a criminal waste of time, and whether or not he used that exact phrase, it captures the spirit of his attitude. He napped strategically, sure, catnaps with steel balls in his hands so he'd wake when they dropped. But to him, long nightly sleep was a design flaw to be engineered around. Electric light was his solution. In 1882, when his Pearl Street station in New York City began pumping electricity into a grid of customers, it turned an abstract invention into an infrastructure. Gas lamps hissed and flickered and required skilled lamplighters to tend them. Electric lights didn't. You could wire them in, flip a switch, and banish the night from a room for as long as you were willing to pay the bill. Cities moved fast. Streets that had been dim even under gaslight became bright corridors of glass and metal. Shop windows glowed into the evening. Factories that had already extended their hours with gas now lit entire production halls with brighter, steadier, safer illumination. Over the next decades, as generation and wiring systems improved, the gas lamps that had once seemed revolutionary were ripped out. The lamplighter, a staple of 19th century streets, became obsolete. Candles and gas had started the siege of the night. Electricity finished it. The consequences went far beyond simple convenience. For hundreds of thousands of years, the daily rhythm of human life had been tightly coupled to a single, blunt environmental signal: the rising and setting of the sun. Your ancestors might have sheltered a fire inside a cave or a hut, but outside the sky's light was the master clock. Dawn woke you. Twilight quieted you. True night told your body, at a cellular level, that it was time to shift into a different mode. Inside your head, that shift is orchestrated by a network of neurons in the hypothalamus, called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the body's master clock. It keeps rough time on its own, but it also listens to your eyes, not the parts that form images, but a special set of light-sensitive cells that care less about shapes and more about brightness and colour. When those cells see daylight, especially the blue-rich light of the sun, they send a message. It's day. Stay alert. Hold off on the night chemistry. One of the key pieces of that chemistry is melatonin, a hormone released by the pineal gland. Under natural conditions, melatonin rises in the evening as the light fades. It helps coordinate the transition into night mode, lowering core body temperature, nudging metabolism, making you feel sleepy. In a dark world, this signal is strong and clear. Electric light scrambles it. Expose a human to bright light during their biological night, and you can cut melatonin production in half. It's especially sensitive to short wavelength blue-tinted light, the kind you get not just from midday sky, but from many modern LEDs and screens. To your clock, that light is a lie, a false sunrise at 10 p.m., a miniature noon at midnight. When that lie arrives every evening, day after day, something subtle but profound happens. Your internal night slides later. Melatonin release is delayed. The point in your 24-hour cycle when your body expects to be asleep, your circadian sleep window, shifts toward the small hours. You turn, biologically, into more of a night owl, even if your genes would have set you somewhere earlier on the spectrum. Under campfires and candles, this effect existed but was constrained. Low levels of warm orange light don't do much to melatonin. Under gas, the push was stronger. Under bright electric lighting, especially as bulbs got cheaper and more efficient, the push became relentless. And the social world leaned into it. If factories with gas lamps could stretch work into the evening, factories with electric light could stretch it indefinitely. The same infrastructure that lit streets and showrooms also made it economically rational to run machines all night long. Why let capital sit idle in the dark when you could plug the night full of shifts? Shift work, in a basic form, had existed before. Night watchmen, bakers, the crews of ships. But electrification industrialized it. You could divide the day into 2 shifts, then 3. You could run 24-hour steel mills, textile plants, telephone exchanges. Workers took turns living against the sun. Entertainment followed. Cafes and music halls that had once closed at reasonable hours pushed later, then later. With safe, bright light, you could gather crowds at midnight without the same fear of crime or fire. Neon signs and illuminated billboards turned the night into a marketplace. The city never truly slept, it just pulsed. In the 20th century, another layer was added. First came radio, then television, then the digital networks that quietly knit the globe into a single, jittery nervous system. Electric light had freed humans from the darkness. Electronics freed them from each other's time zones. Somewhere it was always day. Somewhere someone was awake, sending a message you might feel obligated to answer. Every one of these steps, factories, nightlife, screens, pulled human activity further away from the solar cycle and deeper into what you could think of as the electrical cycle, the rhythm of grids and markets and global communications. For the system, this was an incredible gain in flexibility. For individual bodies, it was an invitation to chronic misalignment. Chronobiologists have a phrase for the result: social jet lag. When you fly across time zones, you feel the mismatch between the clock on the wall and the clock in your head as grogginess, digestive weirdness, mood swings. Your internal night is still back where you came from, even though the sun has moved on. Social jet lag is the same phenomenon without the airplane. Your internal clock, shaped by light exposure, may be set to a midnight to 8 sleep ideal. Your job, your commute, your kids' school insist that you be fully functional at 7 in the morning. You live as if you've flown several time zones east every Monday morning and stagger home every Friday night. Researchers like Till Renneberg measure this by looking at the difference between when people sleep on work days and when they sleep on free days. In many industrialized populations, more than 2/3 of people show at least an hour of discrepancy. For a large fraction, it's 2 hours or more. Their bodies want to sleep and wake later than their schedules permit. The alarm clock becomes less a reminder and more a daily act of violence against their biology. What this does to health is still being mapped out. Large observational studies link higher levels of social jet lag to increased risks of obesity, metabolic problems, and cardiovascular markers. Performance suffers. Mood suffers. None of this proves simple one-way causation. Humans are messy, and so are their lives. But the pattern is hard to ignore. Under candles and stars, your ancestors' biggest sleep problem was staying unconscious, long enough without getting eaten, robbed, or burned. Under electric light, the problem inverted. The danger isn't that the world will intrude on your sleep by force, it's that you'll be tempted or compelled to intrude on it yourself, night after night, until your internal clocks lose track of where they are. By the early 20th century, then, two massive shifts had converged. Industrial time discipline had carved the day into rigid work blocks and elevated 8 continuous hours of night sleep into an ideal. Electrification had dissolved the natural boundaries of that night and given both employers and individuals the power to ignore their own darkness almost at will. The stage was set for a collision, an ancient nervous system, tuned by millions of years of sunrise and sunset, slammed into a world that could simulate daytime indefinitely and demand alertness on command. And as we'll see, the cost of that collision wouldn't just be a few tired mornings. In some cases, it would be measured in wrecked machines, burning factories, derailed trains, and lives abruptly cut short. The first big warning didn't arrive as a medical study or a TED talk. It arrived as a plume of radioactive steam. On March 28, 1979, at 4:00 in the morning, a nuclear reactor at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania began to fail. A valve stuck open. Cooling water escaped. Alarms wailed in a control room full of blinking lights and sleepy operators who had already been on duty for hours, working at the deadest point in the human circadian cycle. What they saw on their panels didn't match what was actually happening inside the reactor. In those first crucial minutes, they misread the situation. They shut off systems that should have stayed on. They tried to solve the wrong problem. You can list all the contributing factors: poor control room design, confusing indicators, gaps in training, management culture. Investigators did exactly that. But threaded through all of it was something simpler and more ancient. Human brains trying to do complex, high-stakes problem-solving at a time of night when evolution never expected them to be in charge of anything more dangerous than a campfire. The result was a partial meltdown. Less than a decade later, halfway around the world, the pattern repeated itself, only worse. Chernobyl, Ukraine, April 26, 1986. Time: 1:23 a.m. The reactor crew had already been through a long disrupted workday. A planned safety test kept being delayed, then rescheduled, then pushed deep into the night shift. By the time the operators actually started the experiment, they were running a complex, marginally understood procedure on an unstable reactor during the window, when human alertness is at its lowest. Again, it wasn't just sleep. The reactor design was flawed. The test was poorly planned. There were political pressures, safety shortcuts, communication failures. But when investigators went back through the timeline, they kept coming back to the same theme. The people in that control room made a cascade of bad decisions while cognitively impaired, asked to perform with precision at an hour when their biology was pushing them toward unconsciousness. This time, the price wasn't just a damaged plant. It was an explosion that blew the top off a reactor, spread radioactive material across Europe, and turned an entire region into a long-term exclusion zone. And in between those two nuclear disasters, another kind of catastrophe unspooled in slow motion through the cold Alaskan night. March 24th, 1989. Exxon Valdez, a massive oil tanker, leaves the port of Valdez and heads into Prince William Sound. Shortly after midnight, the captain leaves the bridge. An overworked third mate takes the helm, trying to steer the ship around ice. The National Transportation Safety Board later concluded that his performance was deficient, probably because of fatigue. The crew was too small for the workload. The shifts were long. Rest was inadequate. 95,000 square kilometres of ocean and shoreline would soon be smeared with crude oil. Again, not just one cause. There were navigation issues, corporate decisions, failures of oversight, but the person at the wheel in those fateful minutes was a human who had been systematically deprived of the one resource that makes our big, expensive brains work properly: sleep. This isn't a conspiracy theory. Government reports and engineering analyses keep flagging the same thing. Whenever you run critical systems through the night and staff them with sleep-deprived humans, you're deliberately operating closer to the edge of disaster. The space program wasn't immune either. In the run-up to the Challenger launch in 1986, engineers and managers argued late into the night on teleconferences about the risks of launching in cold weather. There were data, doubts, political pressure, schedules. Human factors analyses later noted that some of the key decision-makers had slept little, if at all, before they were asked to weigh that risk and give a go or no-go in the early morning hours. Fatigue didn't blow up the shuttle by itself, but it dulled the edges of judgment at a moment when nuance mattered. These aren't quirky anecdotes, they're symptoms. Once you start looking, you see the same fingerprints: extended shifts, circadian lows, chronic sleep restriction in aviation, rail, trucking, medicine. Anywhere the 24/7 world touches human nervous systems and asks them to perform as if they too were made of steel and silicon. Take the roads. In official US statistics, drowsy driving shows up in only a small slice of fatal crashes, hundreds of deaths a year. But those numbers are based on what investigators can prove after the fact, and sleep leaves no skid marks. When sleep researchers try to estimate the real toll, some put it an order of magnitude higher. Thousands of deaths every year, with tens of thousands more serious injuries. The mechanisms are simple and brutal. As you stay awake, especially past your natural bedtime, your reaction times slow, your attention flickers. Microsleeps, those terrifying half-second lapses where the brain simply shuts off, start slipping into your consciousness, whether you want them or not. At highway speeds, a 1-second micro-blackout is the difference between correcting a drift and drifting into oncoming traffic. It's not just cars. In aviation, fatigue shows up again and again in accident reports. Depending on how you count, fatigue plays a role in a notable fraction of civil aviation accidents, from minor runway excursions to major crashes. Pilots working long-duty days, flying overnight or crossing multiple time zones show exactly the same cognitive erosion you'd expect from lab experiments. Slower reaction times, worse judgment, more tunnel vision. In 2010, Air India Express Flight 812 overshot a runway and crashed. Investigators pointed to a captain who had fallen asleep during the flight and was groggy and disoriented when he woke up on final approach. One human brain, a few hours short on sleep, suddenly became the weakest link in a chain of metal and software moving at 150 knots. Trains tell the same story. Derailments and collisions have been traced to engineers who nodded off, dispatchers who misread signals near the end of punishing shifts, maintenance crews who missed critical warnings after nights of fractured, insufficient sleep. But nowhere is the paradox more stark than in medicine. For most of the 20th century, the culture of medical training treated sleep deprivation as a kind of hazing ritual. Young doctors, residents, were expected to work 36-hour shifts night after night, proving their dedication by staying awake. The assumption was that this built toughness. The reality, when someone finally measured it, was that it built errors. In intensive care units where interns worked traditional schedules with frequent 24-hour-plus shifts, researchers logged the mistakes. When they compared those units to ones where residence hours were cut back, no extended shifts, more protected sleep, they saw something stark. Serious medical errors didn't just tick up a bit under sleep deprivation, they multiplied. One randomized trial found that interns on the old-style schedules made about 5 times more serious diagnostic mistakes than when they were on schedules without those long, punishing shifts. More wrong medications, more missed lab results, more failures to notice that a patient was crashing until it was too late. Behind those statistics were names, families, funerals. Cases like that helped push reforms. New York's response to the Libby Zion case in the 1980s, nationwide duty hour limits in the early 2000s. But even after those changes, residents routinely hover on the edge of chronic sleep debt. Average sleep crept up towards 7 hours on paper, but any night with less than 5 hours still carried a measurable spike in errors and on-the-job accidents. We had built a system that took the people we trust with our lives, put them in fluorescent-lit environments at 3:00 a.m., and treated 8 hours of continuous alertness as something you could just will into existence by force of character. Sound familiar? At a societal scale, these disasters and near misses are the modern mirror image of your ancestors' dilemma. For hundreds of thousands of years, the danger of sleep was simple. If you let your guard down in a hostile world, if you slept too deeply by the savannah's edge or next to a thatched roof lit by open flame, you might not wake up. Sleep could kill you because the world stayed dangerous while you were unconscious. Now, the world is still dangerous when you're unconscious, but the bigger threat often arrives when you're awake at the wrong time, doing the wrong kind of task with the wrong kind of brain. Sleep nearly killed us once because we couldn't avoid it in a world full of predators, bandits, and fire. Today, sleep nearly kills us because we try to avoid it in a world full of reactors, tankers, high-speed vehicles, and global schedules. None of the people in those control rooms and cockpits woke up and decided, "Today I will cause a disaster." They were doing what their systems expected of them, showing up, staying on, pushing through. The same cultural story that Edison helped popularize, that sleep is negotiable, a luxury, a waste, had hardened into shift rosters, launch windows, and economic incentives. The result isn't just a few spectacular headlines every decade. It's a quiet, ongoing attrition. The extra crash that didn't have to happen. The patient who might have lived if the intern had been less foggy. The routine decision made at 2:00 a.m. that would have gone differently at 10 a.m. These are not individual moral failures. They are the predictable outcome of building 24-hour systems on top of 300,000-year-old biology and pretending the biology will adapt on command. Sleep, it turns out, is not impressed by markets, launch schedules, or quarterly reports. You can postpone it. You can fragment it. You can light the night until your streets look like noon. But the bill still comes due, one way or another. To understand why the bill is so steep, why losing even a little sleep can twist judgment and slow reflexes so dramatically, we have to zoom in, past factories and freeways, into the organ that pays the price, the sleeping brain itself. The first surprise is that sleep isn't one thing. From the outside, it looks like a single, boring state. Eyes closed, unresponsive, maybe snoring a little. From the inside, it's more like a 4-act play that repeats over and over through the night, with very different things happening in each act. If we could zoom into your brain on a normal night, we'd see a pattern that's almost eerily regular. About every 90 minutes, You cycle through a sequence of stages: light sleep, deeper sleep, the deepest slow-wave sleep, and then REM, rapid eye movement sleep, the stage where dreaming explodes into colour and narrative. You slip into stage N1, that threshold where your thoughts start melting into images and you might swear you're still awake. This is the loose hinge between worlds. Muscles relax, brain waves slow. It's easy to wake you. A few minutes later, you drop into N2. This is light non-REM sleep, but it's not idle time. Your brain starts firing off little electrical bursts called sleep spindles and K-complexes. They look like random squiggles on an EEG, but they're doing critical bookkeeping, filtering what sensory information gets in, making it harder for every creak and car horn to wake you, and helping begin the process of encoding memories from the day. Then the real heavy machinery rumbles to life. Stage N3, slow wave sleep. High amplitude, slow delta waves roll across the cortex. Your heart rate drops. Blood pressure falls. If someone shakes you, you're disoriented, pulled up from a long way down. This is the stage your ancestors needed when they staggered back to camp after a hunt or a forced march across an ice-blown ridge. It's when muscles repair microscopic damage, when growth hormone surges, when the body quietly patches itself. But N3 isn't just a spa day for muscles. It's when the brain does some of its dirtiest work. Between your brain cells, there's a kind of plumbing network. Glial cells, cerebrospinal fluid, microscopic channels that researchers call the glymphatic system. During deep sleep, those channels open up and the space between neurons expands. Fluid starts pulsing through, literally washing away metabolic waste, including misfolded proteins like beta amyloid that are linked, in some studies, to dementia when they build up. In animal experiments, that cleaning system is dramatically more active during deep sleep than during waking. It's as if your brain schedules its garbage collection for the night shift, when the streets are quiet and the trucks can actually get through. N3 also seems to be when your brain takes facts, pin codes, vocabulary, where you parked, and moves them from fragile short-term buffers into more stable networks. Not perfectly, not exclusively. Neuroscientists still argue about which memories get processed where. But if you try to learn something new and then skip deep sleep, the next day it's like trying to recall text you never quite finished typing. After 30 to 40 minutes of this deep slow-wave immersion, your brain climbs back up through lighter stages, and then, suddenly, flips into something that looks almost like waking. REM. On an EEG, REM sleep is fast, chaotic activity. Your eyes dart under closed lids. Breathing becomes irregular. Your body temperature regulation goes weird. But your skeletal muscles go limp, paralyzed by design, so you don't act out your dreams and sprint into the nearest wall. This is where your emotional life gets edited. The same circuits that light up when you're terrified or overjoyed, amygdala, hippocampus, prefrontal cortex, start replaying the day's experiences, but now they're running in a different chemical soup, awash in acetylcholine with stress chemicals like noradrenaline dialed way down. It's like watching a scary movie with the volume turned low. The images are still vivid, but the raw panic is blunted. Over many nights, that REM process seems to strip some of the emotional sting out of memories while preserving their meaning. You don't forget the argument, or the accident, or the humiliation at work, but it may slowly lose its power to hijack your whole nervous system every time you think about it. Skill memories, riding a bike, playing piano, that weird combo you're trying to learn in your favorite game, also benefit from REM. It helps your brain reorganize motor patterns, strengthen useful connections, prune others. Practice in the day, sleep at night, wake up better. It feels like magic. It's not. It's architecture. Through a normal night, these 90-minute cycles repeat 4 to 6 times. Early in the night you get more slow-wave, body repair, waist clearance sleep. Later in the night, especially toward dawn, REM episodes get longer and more elaborate. That already tells you something important. Whatever ideal sleep is, it isn't just about total minutes. It's about giving your brain time to run multiple full cycles. Enough passes through the car wash that both the mud and the bugs come off. So who's running this schedule? Why does it tend to happen at night instead of in the middle of the afternoon, or in 4 evenly spaced naps? Here we meet the second surprise. You don't have one sleep system. You have two, constantly tugging on each other. In the 1980s, a Swiss scientist named Alexander Borbély described what's now called the two-process model of sleep. Process S is your homeostatic sleep drive. The longer you're awake, the more pressure builds to knock you out. Process C is your circadian rhythm, the roughly 24-hour clock in your brain that says, now is a good time to be awake, now is a good time to sleep. Process S is basically a biological hourglass. As you move through the day, your brain burns energy and produces byproducts like adenosine. Adenosine molecules slowly clog up specific receptors, especially in areas that regulate alertness, making you feel heavy-eyed and dull. When you finally sleep, especially in deep NREM, adenosine gets cleared out. Flip the hourglass. Start again. Process C, meanwhile, sits in a tiny bundle of neurons in your hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. It keeps time by reading light. Morning sunlight hits receptors in your eyes and effectively tells the clock, daytime starts now. Hormones like melatonin and cortisol rise and fall on this schedule. Body temperature follows. Metabolism follows. There's a time of day when your brain is naturally sharpest, and a time when it's dragging, even if the adenosine hourglass hasn't piled up that much sand yet. You feel sleepy when these two processes line up, when your homeostatic drive is high and your circadian clock is pointing toward night. You feel bizarrely wired at 11 p.m. after crossing time zones because the clock and the hourglass are out of sync. Lots of adenosine pushing you down, circadian signals trying to hold you up. Caffeine works, incidentally, by barging into those adenosine receptors and sitting there blocking the "you are tired" message without actually removing the adenosine. The hourglass keeps filling. When the caffeine lets go, all that backlog hits you at once. That's the crash. Put process S and process C together, and you get a pattern that, for most adults, nudges them toward a consolidated block of night sleep and a mild dip in the mid-afternoon. That's the biological skeleton. Culture wraps hours and schedules around it. But here's where the story gets even messier and more human. Not everyone's circadian clock keeps exactly the same time. Some people's internal day runs a bit short. They get sleepy at 9 p.m., wake up at 5 a.m. Honestly, they like it. These are the larks. Others have clocks that run a little long. Their alertness curve is shifted later. They don't hit their mental stride until evening, and sleep tries to drag them under sometime after midnight. These are the owls. You can nudge these tendencies with light, behavior, and habit, but they're not just choices or laziness. Twin studies and genetic work show that chronotype, whether you skew morning or evening, is influenced by variants in clock genes like PER and clock. Some people are born out of sync with a 9-to-5 world. When you force everyone into a single schedule, school at 7:30 a.m. for teenagers whose clocks naturally run late, night shifts for larks whose biology screams for sleep at 10 p.m., you're not creating a level playing field. You're creating systematic winners and losers. Some people show up with their cognitive peak centered right on the workday. Others arrive in a fog and only clear up when the day is already over. The brain, of course, doesn't just give up. If you cut your sleep short, especially for a night or two, it starts doing triage. When researchers restrict people to a few hours in bed, the proportion of deep NREM and REM in that shrunken slice of sleep often goes up. You fall into slow wave faster. You plunge into REM more quickly. Your brain tries to protect the most critical stages, even if it can't fully make up the lost time. There's an even more dramatic version of this, REM rebound. If you selectively suppress REM by waking people every time they enter it, or with certain drugs, then let them sleep freely, REM doesn't just return to normal, it overshoots. Dream-rich periods get longer. The brain rushes back to the stage it's been denied, as if insisting, that part of the night matters. You don't get to skip it forever. Over longer stretches of chronic sleep restriction, this compensation breaks down. Performance drops, reaction times slow, emotional control phrase, even if people swear they feel fine. But the flexibility's real. Sleep architecture reshuffles, NREM and REM ratios adjust, circadian signals bend but don't quite break. All of this fits uncomfortably well with that long pre-industrial, pre-electric history of human sleep. We're not built with a single hard-coded instruction. Sleep 8 hours in one unbroken block at the same time, or perish. We're built with a layered system, cycles within cycles, clocks interacting with chemical hourglasses, stages that can expand and contract depending on what you've deprived yourself of and what your life demands. Your hunter-gatherer ancestors who grabbed broken chunks of sleep around a fire. Your medieval relatives who dozed in a first sleep, woke to talk or pray, then slid into a second. The sailor napping in 20-minute bursts between watches. The exhausted nurse crashing after a night shift. Every one of those patterns leans on the same underlying machinery. Sleep is not infinitely flexible. You can't cheat it forever without cost. But it's more like a jazz score than a factory whistle. Structured, rhythmic, full of repeating motifs, yet able to improvise around interruptions, shifting tempos to keep the most important parts of the performance in place. The problem isn't that our sleep system is rigid and fragile. The problem is that we've built social and economic systems that assume it's infinitely bendable, and then act shocked when the biology pushes back. So when somebody tells you, with great authority, you must sleep 8 hours a night or you're killing yourself, it sounds scientific. It sounds like the long-lost biological rule we finally rediscovered after centuries of candles and factory whistles. There's just one problem. When you actually look at the data that tracks who lives and who dies over decades, the magic number that keeps showing up is not 8, it's closer to 7. In the early 2000s, a sleep researcher named Daniel Kripke and his colleagues did something very unromantic. No brainwaves, no dream diaries. They simply followed tens of thousands of people for years, asked how much they slept, and then watched what happened. When they plotted sleep duration against risk of death, the curve that came out was not a straight line. It didn't say more sleep, always better, or less sleep, always tougher and more optimized. It made a U-shape. People reporting around 7 hours of sleep a night tended to have the lowest mortality. As you moved left, down to 6, 5 hours, the risk crept up. As you moved right, 9, 10, 11 hours, it crept up again. Not in a dramatic fall-off-a-cliff way, but clearly, reliably. That single study could have been a fluke, but it didn't stand alone for long. A decade and a half later, a huge meta-analysis pulled together 40 prospective cohort studies, about 2.2 million adults, over 270,000 deaths. Different countries, different time periods, different ways of asking about sleep. The same basic pattern emerged. 7 hours sat at the bottom of the curve. At 6 hours, risk of dying from any cause was a little higher, on the order of a few percent. At 5 hours, a bit higher again. Still not instant doom, but moving in the wrong direction. On the long sleep side, 9 hours of reported sleep carried a clearly higher risk than 7. 10 and 11 hours, higher still. By 11 hours a night, the risk bump was roughly comparable to what you saw in the shortest sleepers. So what do we do with that? First, we notice that the ideal isn't a hard cliff at 8 hours. It's a shallow valley centered somewhere around 7, with a wide, forgiving floor. 6.5, 7.5, even 8 aren't different universes. They're all in the neighborhood where, for large populations, mortality risk looks relatively low. Second, we ask why the U-shape exists at all. On the short sleep side, there are lots of plausible biological culprits. People who regularly sleep less than 6 hours a night, especially over years, tend to show higher rates of obesity, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and cardiovascular disease. Their blood pressure stays elevated longer. Their glucose control gets sloppier. Inflammatory markers in the blood tick up. Appetite hormones skew in ways that make you hungrier and more likely to crave calorie-dense food. You don't need to invoke mysterious energy fields. You can see concrete pathways from chronic short sleep to the kind of chronic diseases that kill people in midlife and beyond. The long sleep side is murkier. It's tempting to say, "Oh, sleeping 10 hours must be toxic. Moderation in all things." But when researchers dig into who the long sleepers are, a pattern emerges. Many of them are already sick. People with depression, people with chronic inflammatory illnesses, people whose bodies are fighting off cancers, or whose hearts and lungs are already struggling. Low physical activity, unemployment, social isolation, these all show up more frequently on the long sleep end of the curve. In other words, it's very likely that for many of these people, long sleep isn't the cause of higher mortality. It's a symptom. The body is demanding more rest because something is wrong. The same underlying disease that makes you need 10 hours is the thing that shortens your life. That's why epidemiologists keep repeating a boring but crucial disclaimer. Correlation is not causation. Observational sleep studies don't tuck people into labs for 20 years and assign them a fixed bedtime. They ask what people are already doing and track outcomes. Confounders lurk everywhere. So the U-shaped mortality curve is real, robust, and also messy. It tells you that, in large groups of adults, roughly 7 hours of nightly sleep is associated with the lowest death rates. It tells you that consistently sleeping much less than that probably isn't great for your cardiovascular system. It hints that very long sleep often signals hidden trouble. What it doesn't tell you is that there is a precise universal commandment: eat or perish. That commandment, culturally, comes from somewhere else. In 2017, a neuroscientist named Matthew Walker published a book with a title that is both irresistible and slightly threatening: Why We Sleep. It was a runaway hit. Translators put it into dozens of languages. CEOs waved it around in presentations. Parents bought it for their chronically exhausted kids. School boards and policymakers cited it when arguing for later start times. The book's central message landed hard. Most of us are dangerously sleep-deprived, and the modern world has engineered a kind of silent sleep loss epidemic. Walker hammered home the idea that adults need 8 hours of sleep, not as a rough guideline, but almost as a biological non-negotiable. Anything less shaved away at your health, your memory, your lifespan. On one level, this did enormous good. It made sleep part of public conversation in a way it simply hadn't been. Instead of bragging about 5 hours as a badge of honor, people started to feel, correctly, that consistent sleep loss has real costs. But in the years that followed, something more uncomfortable happened. Careful readers, and then professional statisticians, started checking some of the book's specific claims and citations. A programmer and essayist named Alexei Guzzi wrote a long methodical critique pointing out factual errors, misquoted studies, and even a graph that seemed to have had inconvenient data points quietly removed to make the trend line look cleaner. The statistician Andrew Gelman amplified those concerns in the scientific blog world. One misstep became almost infamous: the claim that the World Health Organization had declared a global sleep loss epidemic. It hadn't. The phrase made the problem sound more official and dire than any UN body had actually stated. The upshot is not that Walker was wrong about everything. The broad strokes, that chronic short sleep impairs health and cognition, that our 24/7 culture pushes many of us into deficit, are widely supported. The problem is the precision and the fear. 8 hours or you're wrecking your brain is a powerful headline. It's also not what the evidence actually says. When real people internalize that as gospel, something ironic happens. Sleep itself becomes a source of anxiety. You lie in bed, clock glowing at 11:47 p.m, alarms set for 6:30, and start doing panicked math. That's less than 8 hours. I'm losing brain cells. I'm raising my Alzheimer's risk right now. Your heart rate goes up. Your stress hormones spike. Sleep, unsurprisingly, retreats further out of reach. We've managed to turn a biological necessity into a performance metric. On the other side, of course, sits hustle culture. Those endless clips of entrepreneurs saying, if you're sleeping 8 hours a night, you're already losing. The idea that real winners get by on 4 or 5, that tiredness is just weakness in need of more coffee and discipline. That story is just as misleading, but in a different direction. For most adults, 5 hours is not enough. You can white-knuckle through it for a while. Your subjective sense of I'm doing fine will plateau even as your reaction times, emotional control and long-term health metrics quietly degrade. You're trading away resilience for a little more waking time, like burning furniture to keep the lights on. If you zoom out from both extremes, the doom scroll of less than 8 equals brain death, and the grind set of sleep is for the weak, a more complicated and more human picture appears. Sleep need varies. It varies with age. Teenagers genuinely need more than middle-aged adults. Older adults often sleep less at night but may nap more. It varies with genetics. There are rare individuals with mutations in genes like DEC2 who really can function well on 6 hours. There are also true long sleepers who feel and perform better at 9. It varies with what your days look like. Training for a marathon, recovering from illness, adjusting to a new time zone, dealing with heavy cognitive or emotional load, all of these can nudge your sleep requirement up or down. The giant epidemiological curves don't erase that individuality. They average across it. 7 hours as the mortality minimum is a population-level statement, not a personalized prescription. So what do you actually do with all this? You, a single person living in a specific body, under specific pressures, in a world that talks out of both sides of its mouth about rest. You use the science not as a whip, but as a compass. You know that chronically pushing your sleep below 6 hours is probably a bad long-term strategy, however noble the reason. You know that sleeping 11 hours every day without obvious cause might be a signal worth checking out with a doctor, not a quirky personal choice. But you also know that there is no sacred commandment that says 800 is the only safe password to longevity. If you're consistently waking up without an alarm after 7 hours, feeling alert and stable through the day, not crashing on weekends to catch up, the data suggests you're likely in a healthy zone, even if the cultural script tells you you're 1 hour short. The real rule isn't 8 hours or else. It's quieter and more demanding. Your body has a sleep need. It will change across your life. It will not always align with what your job or your culture wants from you. Learn how it speaks. Pay attention to how you feel, not just what the clock says. And whenever you can, arrange your waking world so that your sleeping brain can do the deep, cyclical work it has been rehearsing since long before factories, or clocks, or self-help books tried to tell it what normal was supposed to be. So far we've been talking mostly about numbers: 7 hours, 8 hours, U-shaped curves and mortality risk. But if you zoom out from the spreadsheets and look at actual human lives, in actual human cultures, something else becomes glaringly obvious. The way you and I are told to sleep, one clean block at night, no naps, no dozing at work, no wasting the day, is not some timeless biological law. It's an accent, a local dialect of sleep, and a lot of the world never spoke it. Let's leave the Anglo-American world for a moment, the land of power through the afternoon slump and coffee is for closers, and walk into a small Spanish town before air conditioning and global conference calls. The sun is brutal. Stone walls throw back heat like an oven. You eat the main meal of the day around 2, maybe 3 in the afternoon. After that, there's a pause. Shops close their shutters. Streets go quiet. People lie down. The siesta wasn't some lazy indulgence bolted onto an otherwise normal day. It was the spine of the schedule. You divided your waking hours into 2 distinct chunks. A morning work block, then a long midday break, then an evening and night block that often stretched late. Work, rest, work, wake, sleep, wake. And that pattern didn't just match the climate, it matched the body. If you hook people up to thermometers and EEGs and strip away social schedules, no email, no school bells, no afternoon meetings, you find something surprisingly stubborn. Most humans show a dip in alertness and a drop in core body temperature in the early afternoon, roughly between 1 and 3 p.m. It happens even if you give everyone identical meals at different times. It's not just, I ate too much pasta. It's baked into our circadian machinery, a mini nightfall inside the day. Siesta cultures simply listen to it. Mediterranean and many Latin American towns historically structured everything around this lull. Markets and offices closed. The hottest, least productive hours turned into sanctioned sleep. In rural parts of Africa and South America, anthropologists still find the phasic days. People sleep a shorter spell at night and then take real, unapologetic rest when the sun is at its most burnished. The result isn't necessarily less token sleep. It's carved differently. 7 or 8 hours over 24, yes, but in 2 pieces. Now watch what happens when industrial time starts pushing in. Factories don't like pauses. Global markets don't care about the Andalusian sun. Over the 20th century, Spain and Italy came under increasing pressure to synchronize with Central and Northern Europe. Continuous business hours, standardized closing times, TV schedules, train timetables, call centers. The cultural memory of siesta stayed powerful. You can still buy postcards and tourist trinkets about it, but the daily practice eroded. Surveys in the 2000s and 2010s suggested most Spaniards no longer nap on workdays. Governments debated shortening the long midday break and shifting the whole country's clock to better match German and French business hours. Biology didn't change. The post-lunch dip didn't vanish, but the schedules did. And that's the recurring theme of modern sleep history. Cultural pressures overruling a flexible plural biology and then pretending that whatever survives is normal. If you hop from Madrid to Tokyo, you don't find a siesta. You find something stranger. In Japan, there's a practice called inamuri. It translates roughly to being present while sleeping. Picture someone on a crowded commuter train, head bobbing, eyes closed, briefcase on their lap. Or an office worker in a meeting, quietly dozing at the edge of the conference table. They're not fired. They're not shamed as weak. Often it's interpreted as a backhanded compliment. This person is so dedicated, so overworked, that they have to steal microrest wherever they can. Sociologists who study inamuri point out that it's governed by rules. You're not allowed to check out completely. You must still be, in some sense, there. Higher status workers can do it more openly than juniors. You can nap on the train, but maybe not in the middle of your own presentation. But underneath the etiquette is a simple reality. Japan never fully swallowed the Anglo rule that sleep belongs only in one big block, at home, in pyjamas. The public micro-nap is tolerated, even in a weird way, respected. Now push further to places where nobody gets to decide that sleep is sacred, because the environment doesn't care about your circadian ideals. Alone on an ocean, racing a 60-foot boat through storms, you can't shut down for 8 hours. There is no night off. The wind doesn't schedule itself around your REM cycles. So solo sailors learn to do something our culture tells us is impossible. Live on distributed naps, 20 minutes here, 40 minutes there, an hour when the weather is stable, days or weeks on end with no consolidated block at all. For decades, a Brazilian-Italian researcher named Claudio Stampi followed these people. He tracked over 100 solo sailors in the field, wired them up in labs, and asked a brutal question. If you can't get normal sleep, what's the least bad way to cheat? When he limited volunteers to around 3 hours of total sleep a day, which, to be clear, is severe deprivation, he tried 2 strategies. One long collapsed chunk, or multiple ultra-short naps scattered through the day and night. The one-block group did terribly. They were groggy, slow, cognitively falling apart. The nappers did less terribly. They still weren't at their best, but their reaction times and decision-making held up far better. The brain under pressure was doing something remarkable. EEG recordings over weeks of fragmented sleep suggested that even when you broke rest into tiny pieces, the overall mix of REM and non-REM stages across 24 hours stayed surprisingly stable. The order got scrambled. The depth and continuity weren't ideal, but the architecture was there, compressed and redistributed. In other words, human sleep isn't a fragile single crystal that shatters if you don't give it 8 uninterrupted hours on a memory foam pillow. It's more like a shapeshifter. When it has to, it can pack the most essential processes into whatever scraps of time it's given. Military units have exploited the same trick in continuous operations. Long-haul truckers use structured naps to avoid drifting off at the wheel. Polar expeditions in months-long daylight and space missions where day and night cycle every 90 minutes all end up wrestling with the same fact. Our biology wants sleep, but it can live with very different ways of getting it. None of this means that you, sitting in a climate-controlled apartment with a 9-to-5 job, should suddenly adopt an extreme polyphasic schedule and boast that you've hacked evolution on 2 hours a day. The internet is full of those claims. The research is not. What Stampi and others actually found is more modest and more interesting. When total sleep has to be restricted, splitting it intelligently is better than letting it erode chaotically. The human sleep system is flexible enough to survive in emergency mode, and while sailors and soldiers are improvising under duress, something else has been quietly happening back in the fluorescent heart of the modern world. Napping has started to crawl out of the shame corner. In the 1990s, a NASA-funded study looked at pilots on long flights. They gave some of them a chance to take a short nap during duty, a 40-minute window in which they averaged about 26 minutes of actual sleep. Then they measured what happened. Alertness jumped by roughly 50%. Performance on tasks improved by more than 30%. Compared to staying awake and toughing it out, the power nap was a clear win. That kind of data is catnip for a certain kind of corporation. Tech companies, always eager to brand themselves as scientifically enlightened, started installing nap pods. Google famously put them on campus. Airports followed, renting little sleep capsules by the hour. Articles in business magazines began to frame the midday nap not as laziness but as optimization. You can see the cultural pivot in the language. People don't say, "I lie down in the afternoon because I'm tired." They say, "I use a 20-minute power nap to boost my productivity." Same behavior, different story. It's easy to be cynical about that. Turning rest into another tool of efficiency doesn't exactly sound like liberation, but it does mark a crack in the wall of the 8-hour myth, because once you acknowledge, as NASA did, that a tiny slice of daytime sleep can dramatically improve function, once you admit, as Mediterranean towns always knew, that the early afternoon is biologically drowsy, once you see a Japanese salaryman sleeping upright on the train without social collapse, the idea that real adults only ever sleep in one pristine nocturnal block starts to look less like a law of nature and more like a very specific cultural script. A script that spread from industrial England and America with clocks and factory whistles and office hours until it seemed universal. But it isn't. Around the world today and across history, humans have slept in 2 chunks, 3 chunks, scattered naps, long siestas, midnight awakenings, communal dozing by the fire. Our brains have carried the same basic machinery, cycles of REM and non-REM, a circadian rhythm with a built-in afternoon valley, through all of it. So when you lie awake at 3 a.m. and think, my sleep is broken because I'm not doing 8 hours straight, or when you fight your eyelids at 2 in the afternoon because napping is for kids and old people, it's worth asking a different question. Is your body malfunctioning, or is your culture insisting on a single, rigid pattern that was never the only way a human could sleep? Because if the siestas of Spain, the inamuri of Japan, the catnaps of solo sailors and astronauts and overworked pilots all teach us anything, it's this. The 8-hour block is not the default. It's just one way, one very recent, very local way, that we learned to divide the long conversation between our waking world and the dark. So here's the twist. Once you build a world around the 8-hour block, clocks, factory shifts, school bells, primetime TV, you don't just change how people sleep. You change what counts as being sick. For most of history, if you woke up at 1 in the morning and stared at the ceiling for an hour, that wasn't a symptom. That was night. In the villages and towns that Roger Akirch dug through in his research, early modern Europe before gas lamps and electric grids, people routinely talked about first sleep and second sleep. Court records, diary entries, even prayer manuals mention it casually. You went to bed after dusk, slept a few hours, woke up around midnight, and then you did things. You got up, threw a log on the fire, maybe checked the animals. You prayed. There were specific devotions recommended between first and second sleep. You whispered to your spouse, had sex, told stories, thought about your life. Then, after an hour or 2 of calm, you lay back down for second sleep and drifted off again. No one wrote, I fear I have middle-of-the-night onset insomnia. They just called it the watch. And if you strip away modern lighting and schedules in a lab, something similar reappears. In the 1990s, psychiatrist Thomas Ware did a strange experiment. He put people on a long winter's night, 10 hours of light, 14 hours of darkness every day for weeks. No phones, no Netflix, no email, just long evenings and a very long night. At first, participants did what you'd expect modern, sleep-deprived humans to do. They crashed. They slept like stones for as many hours as their bodies could grab. But after a while, they settled into a pattern. Their sleep stretched, then split. They began sleeping in 2 chunks, with a quiet, wakeful period in the middle of the dark. Not anxious tossing and turning, just a calm, reflective wakefulness between 2 slabs of deep sleep. When you take away industrial light and industrial time, their brains did something that looks suspiciously like first and second sleep, which raises an awkward possibility. What if the thing so many people describe today, I wake up at 3 a.m. and can't go back to sleep, isn't always a broken system? What if, at least some of the time, it's an older pattern trying to bubble up through a much newer social script? That's not how we've treated it. In the 19th century, as timetables hardened and the urban night brightened, doctors and moralists started to talk differently about sleep. The ideal citizen of an industrial nation did not have time to wander through a leisurely midnight watch. They were supposed to hit the pillow after a long workday and stay down until the alarm. As that ideal spread, any deviation picked up a new label: insomnia. It's in this era that sedatives begin their march. First, crude chemical hammers, bromide salts, chloral hydrate, knockout drops that took people from restless to comatose with all the finesse of a shovel. Then, in the early 1900s, came the barbiturates. Barbital in 1903, phenobarbital a few years later. They were sold as modern miracles. A doctor could now fix your disobedient sleep with a pill. Never mind that these drugs were highly addictive, easy to overdose on, and didn't exactly preserve the brain's natural architecture of REM and non-REM. They made you unconscious. In a world that equated sleep with being knocked out for a solid stretch, that was close enough. By mid-century, the costs were undeniable. Dependence, death from mixing with alcohol, withdrawal seizures. So the next wave rolled in. Benzodiazepines, Librium in the early 1960s, Valium soon after. Then shorter-acting hypnotics like Halcyon promised the same thing but safer. Advertisements showed tranquil housewives, businessmen finally getting the 8 hours they deserved. These drugs were more forgiving than barbiturates, but they still reshaped sleep, still risked tolerance and dependence, still left some users foggy and cognitively dulled. And as they spread, a subtle feedback loop tightened. The more we had powerful tools to enforce a narrow idea of normal sleep, the more anything outside that idea began to look pathological. Don't sleep straight through the night. Disorder. Need a nap. Disorder. Wake gently at 2 a.m. feeling mentally clear. Disorder. Unless you immediately panic about it, in which case definitely disorder. By the late 20th century, sleep had become a medical specialty. The American Academy of Sleep Medicine, originally the American Sleep Disorders Association, formed in the 1970s. Its job was, explicitly, to define, diagnose, and treat sleep problems. First accredited sleep-wake centres appeared by 1977. By the 2000s, there were thousands of accredited sleep clinics across North America alone. This isn't a conspiracy. A lot of this work has been life-saving. Diagnosing sleep apnea, for example, prevents strokes and heart attacks. Understanding narcolepsy and restless legs can transform people's lives. But wrapped up in that real progress is a quieter cultural project. Writing a rule book for how a normal human should sleep. 8 hours, mostly at night, in one chunk. Fall asleep quickly, stay asleep, wake refreshed. Anything else? Maybe a little suspect. Pharmaceutical companies saw the opportunity. After benzodiazepines came the Z drugs, zolpidem, zaleplon, zopiclone, designed to hit many of the same brain receptors, but marketed as cleaner, more natural sleep. Ambien, approved in the US in 1992, became a blockbuster. Commercials showed people sinking into silky, uninterrupted nights, all on command. Later reviews would point out uncomfortable realities. These drugs can alter normal sleep cycles, increase risk of falls and confusion in older adults, cause dependence and bizarre behaviors. For many insomniacs, cognitive behavioral therapy, changing thoughts and habits around sleep, works as well or better. But by the time that nuance caught up, the cultural script was entrenched. You, citizen of the 24-hour world, are supposed to get 8 hours, exactly 8, preferably between 11 p.m. and 7 a.m. If you can't, something is wrong with you. Go see a professional. Ask if this pill is right for you. And here we hit the modern paradox. Tell millions of people that they must get a precise quantity of perfectly consolidated sleep, or their health will collapse, and you create the very problem you're trying to solve. It has a name: sleep anxiety. You lie down at night, check the clock. Okay, if I fall asleep in the next 10 minutes, I'll get exactly 8 hours. You don't fall asleep. 20 minutes go by. Now it's 7 hours and 40. Matthew Walker said bad things happen below 8. Am I shaving days off my life? Your heart rate nudges up. Cortisol trickles into your bloodstream. You start monitoring yourself. Am I too awake? Should I try a breathing app? If I look at my phone, I'll ruin my melatonin. Don't look at the clock. Oh no, I looked at the clock. By the time you finally drift off, you've trained your brain that bed is a place of performance evaluation, not rest. The next night your body remembers. This is the place we worry about how we're sleeping. Congratulations. You've built yourself a self-reinforcing insomnia machine. Here's the irony. When people with this kind of clock-based insomnia are taken into a lab, put in quiet, dim environments, and not told what time it is, they often sleep more than they think. Their brains cycle through REM and non-REM in roughly normal proportions. And when they're given long dark windows like in Vare's 14-hour nights, that old segmented pattern often peeks through. A few hours of deep sleep, a spell of peaceful wakefulness, another few hours of sleep. In other words, left to its own devices, without alarms and screen glow and productivity culture breathing down its neck, human sleep may still want to be more flexible, more layered than our rulebooks allow. This doesn't mean that all insomnia is just repressed by phasic sleep. Chronic sleeplessness can be serious, and medical help is often appropriate. Nor does it mean sleeping pills are evil. For some people, used carefully and briefly, they're a bridge out of a bad patch. But it does suggest something unsettling for the 8-hour myth. Some portion of what we now diagnose, medicalize and medicate as disorder might be our ancestral architecture pushing back against an inflexible schedule. First and second sleep, the midnight watch, the afternoon dip, all the rhythms that made sense around fires and fields, are still wired into bodies that now live under LEDs and Outlook calendars. We taught ourselves to treat those rhythms as defects, and then we built an industry to fix them. Once you see that, the whole insomnia story looks less like a global epidemic of broken brains, and more like a culture that forgot how many different ways a human can move through the dark. So what happens when that culture finally starts to realize the rulebook is wrong? You'd think the rebellion would start with hippies or wellness influencers or monks in the woods. It starts with high school. Because if there is one place where the 24/7 world has been absolutely ruthless, it's the teenage brain at 7:20 a.m. By the time kids hit puberty, their internal clocks slide later. Melatonin, the hormone that helps you get sleepy, rises and falls on a shifted schedule. In lab studies, you can actually measure this. The dim light melatonin onset in a 16-year-old is roughly an hour later than in a 10-year-old, even though the underlying daily rhythm is the same. In other words, teenagers aren't staying up late because TikTok invented sin. Their biology wants them awake at 11 and asleep at 7, not the other way around. Now layer on a school bus at 6:30. For decades, that mismatch was treated as a moral failing. Kids these days are lazy. But in the 1990s, a few school districts did something quietly radical. They looked at the data and moved the bell. In Minneapolis and neighboring districts, high schools shifted start times from around 7:20 a.m. to roughly 8:30 to 8:40. This wasn't an anti-capitalist revolution, it was mostly logistics and buses. But then researchers tracked what happened. Attendance went up, enrollment went up, students reported less daytime sleepiness, fewer depressive symptoms, fewer trips to counselors for behavioral issues. Teachers reported kids were awake. Later, a multi-state study of about 9,000 students found the same pattern. When school started at 8:30 or later, grades and test scores were higher, tardiness dropped, caffeine use went down, reported depression shrank, even substance use ticked lower. And then there was the thing nobody expects from a snooze button: car crashes. Teen drivers in districts that push start times back had fewer accidents. In one Kentucky county, delaying high school by just an hour was associated with roughly a 16% drop in teen crash rates, while the rest of the state, on the same roads, same weather, saw crashes go up. In parts of Virginia, 16 to 18-year-olds in earlier start districts crashed about a third more often than in neighboring later start districts. When Fairfax County shifted its bell about 50 minutes later, teen crashes nudged down. Nearby counties that kept the old schedule didn't see the same change. This is the flip side of the sleep nearly killed us story. If you run a civilization on the assumption that biology will obediently adapt to the timetable, you get drowsy drivers at dawn. If you adjust the timetable to biology, fewer kids die on the way to chemistry class. Eventually someone in power noticed. In 2019, California passed Senate Bill 328, the first statewide law in the US to legislate circadian rhythm. It mandated that most middle schools could not start before 8 a.m. and most high schools could not start before 8:30. Lawmakers explicitly cited adolescent sleep research, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and public health arguments about mental health and crashes. The state basically said, the bell has been wrong, the brain was right. That's not how revolutions usually announce themselves. No barricades, no guillotines, just a quiet shift on the digital marquee in front of your old high school. But once you see it, you start to notice similar cracks forming in other places. Take work. For 2 centuries, the factory clock has ruled adult sleep. Even people in offices still live by its ghost. 9 to 5, 5 days a week, early meetings as proof of dedication, late-night email as proof of loyalty. But there's a new set of experiments running, and this time the test subject isn't just your alarm, it's the work week itself. Across Iceland, the UK, Spain, Germany, New Zealand, and elsewhere, companies and governments have tried something that sounds like science fiction to a 19th century mill owner. 4-day weeks with no cut in pay, not 4 10-hour days, shorter weeks, 32 to 36 hours instead of 40. Coordinated by groups like 4-Day Week Global, these trials have followed thousands of employees for months. The usual metrics of capitalism, revenue, productivity barely budged or even improved. But the human metrics did something else. Burnout fell. Sick days dropped. Self-rated physical and mental health rose. People reported more time with family, more exercise, and more sleep. In UK trials, workers said they were sleeping roughly half an hour to an hour longer per night, with fewer difficulties falling or staying asleep. In Iceland's large-scale trial, participants described less stress and better work-life balance. In a German study, those on 4-day schedules racked up extra weekly sleep and extra physical activity compared with 5-day colleagues. It turns out that if you give people an extra day to recover from the social jet lag of the work week, their bodies do something suspiciously rational. They repair. At the micro level, the same logic is seeping into office culture. Some companies quietly eliminate standing 8 a.m. meetings or ban scheduling before 10 a.m. without consent. Others explicitly tell employees not to answer email at night or build no meeting Wednesdays into the calendar so people can structure focus and rest around their own peaks. A few go further and do something heretical. They put sleep in the employee handbook. There are firms that now run sleep education workshops, subsidize blackout curtains and blue light blocking glasses, or pay for cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia instead of endless Ambien refills. One Japanese company famously offered bonuses to workers who logged healthy sleep durations on tracking devices. A stunt, yes, but also a symbolic inversion of the old norm. Where the industrial barons paid for your overtime, the modern firm experiments with paying for your pillow time. Which brings us to one of the strangest little uprisings of all, the anti-alarm clock movement. For most of history, there were no alarms. Roosters don't count. They're not set to 6:45 sharp every weekday. The mechanical alarm, patented and mass-marketed in the 19th century, is basically a personal factory bell you volunteer to put next to your skull. For a lot of people, that bell has become so normal they can't imagine waking without it. For a small but growing minority, it has become intolerable. These are the people running a different kind of experiment. What happens if I let my body decide when to wake up? Some do it crudely, no alarm on weekends. Others go all in. They track their sleep for weeks, figure out their natural chronotype, lark, owl, or somewhere in between, and then gradually rearrange their schedule around it. They negotiate later start times with bosses, shift to remote work, or cluster tasks that require early morning performance on fewer days so their sleep debt can rebound on the others. Some structure their entire lives around a simple rule: no alarm clocks, ever, unless catching a rare flight. Is this a universal solution? No. Many jobs still expect you to show up when the customers do, not when your melatonin says you're ready. But the mere existence of sleep freedom as an aspiration is new. Humans who spent centuries inventing bells and whistles to force their bodies to obey the clock are now trying, haltingly, experimentally, to bend the clock back toward the body. Technology, predictably, is trying to help, and to cash in. On one side, you have a growing arsenal of gadgets designed to defend old biology against new light. Blue light filtering glasses that cut the most melatonin-suppressing wavelengths from your screen glow. Smartphone apps that tint displays amber at sunset. Operating systems that now ship with night modes built in. On another, you have smart bulbs and lamps that mimic the slow colour shift of dusk and dawn, bright and cool in the morning, warm and dim in the evening, cycling through ancient patterns inside modern apartments. Then there are the tracking devices, watches, rings, headbands that claim to read your heart rate variability and micro movements, to reconstruct your sleep stages and recovery scores. Many of them are crude compared to polysomnography in a lab. They mislabel wake as light sleep, or guess wrong about REM. But they also do something subtle at the cultural level. They frame sleep as something you can optimize. The same way you might track steps or calories, you can now track your sleep efficiency and readiness score. To an older generation, going to bed early was laziness. To the Netflix generation with a $300 wearable, it's training. There's something a little dystopian about turning rest into a performance metric. But wrapped up in that is a genuine shift in values. For a long time, cultural heroes bragged about how little they slept. Thomas Edison called sleep a criminal waste of time. Margaret Thatcher supposedly ran on 4 hours a night. Hustle culture adopted the same script. Sleep when you're dead. In the 21st century, the bragging rights started to invert. Elite athletes talk about logging 9 hours as carefully as they talk about logging miles in training. Tech CEOs post about their wind-down routines and screen curfews. Pop science books proclaim sleep a superpower, the best legal performance enhancer you're not using enough. Public health campaigns talk about sleep the way we used to talk about smoking cessation or exercise, a pillar of heart health, mental stability, immune function. Even the office warrior, 5 coffees deep, has at least heard that pulling all-nighters shreds memory and judgment. In other words, sleep has been rebranded. Not as idleness, but as infrastructure. And yet, for all the apps and laws and experiments, the revolution is very far from won. School start time reforms exist, But in most of the world, teenagers are still boarding buses before dawn. 4-day weeks have passionate advocates and dramatic pilot results, but they're still rare enough to be newsworthy precisely because they're unusual. Flexible schedules cluster in knowledge work bubbles. Nurses, warehouse workers, cleaners, and delivery drivers still organize their entire lives around shifts, not chronotypes. The devices that promise sleep optimization are expensive. The people most battered by shift work and multiple jobs, the ones paying the highest health price for misaligned sleep, are often the last and least able to participate in sleep freedom. And behind all of it, the same old economic engine hums along, quietly rewarding those who answer email at midnight, say yes to the 6 a.m. call with the overseas office, pick up the graveyard shift because somebody has to. The quiet revolution is real. It's written into laws like California's, into pilot programs in Iceland, into the night mode setting on your phone. But it's incomplete, uneven, and fragile. We are very slowly remembering that our brains and bodies are older than the factory bell, that our sleep is not a defect to be beaten into compliance with the 24/7 world. The next step is more dangerous and more interesting. It's what happens when you ask, if our biology has been fighting back this hard, what did our ancestors know about sleep that we've forgotten? Your ancestors did not have a bedtime. They had night. And the night was not empty. It was structured, layered, and surprisingly intelligent. For most of the last 300,000 years, sleep was not the single, sacred, uninterrupted 8-hour block you're told to chase now. It was a moving pattern, shaped by seasons, latitude, firelight, danger, hunger, and the needs of the group. Sometimes it was a long winter hibernation mode, more time in the dark, more time half asleep around the fire, bodies conserving energy when food ran low. Sometimes it was fractured by heat in the tropics, with a chunk of rest in the afternoon shade and more alertness in the cooler night. Sometimes it was brutally constrained by migration, hunting, or war. Short naps grabbed in shifts while someone else kept watch for predators, raiders, or flames. Your ancestors' nervous systems evolved inside that mess, and one of the clearest fingerprints of that old flexibility is something early modern Europeans took for granted, and you've probably never experienced on purpose: first sleep and second sleep. In diaries, court records, medical texts from a few centuries ago, people casually mention their first sleep as if everyone knows what they mean. You go to bed a couple hours after dark. You sleep for maybe 4 hours. Then you wake up, on purpose, not in panic, for an hour or two. You talk quietly with your spouse. You pray. You stoke the fire. You step outside to check the animals, or just look at the stars. Then, when drowsiness returns, you slip into your second sleep until dawn. Nobody calls this insomnia. It's just how the night works. When researchers in the 1990s stuck people in a lab with long winter nights, 10, 12, 14 hours of darkness and no screens, something eerie happened. After a few days of catching up on debt, their sleep began to split. 2 main 4-ish hour blocks separated by a calm, reflective period of wakefulness in the middle. Blood tests showed their hormones shifting into a kind of quiet, contemplative mode during that wakeful watch, something between meditation and grogginess. In other words, when you strip away alarms and LEDs, a lot of modern humans naturally fall into the same segmented pattern that shows up in those old records. First sleep, watch, second sleep. Some historians argue about how universal that pattern was. Maybe it was mostly Europeans in a certain climate at a certain time. Fair enough. Yeah. But between the written records and the lab experiments, one thing is hard to ignore. Your biology comes preloaded with more than one way to sleep. Circadian experiments in underground bunkers show the same theme. Take away clocks and social cues, and people don't become perfectly 24-hour metronomes. Their internal days drift a little long, 24.2 hours, 24.5. They still anchor to roughly one cycle of light and dark, but the exact timing of sleep and wake is fuzzy, elastic, negotiable. Now compare that to the world you live in. You've been taught that a good sleeper is someone who lies down at 11, goes unconscious like a Netflix app losing Wi-Fi, and pops up at 7, refreshed, ready to produce. Same hours, every night, regardless of season, latitude, job, age, or genetics. Anything else, waking at 3 a.m., needing a nap, struggling to fall asleep at 10, is a problem. That definition is not coming from your DNA. It's coming from the factory. When mass industrialization hit, the priority was not your REM cycles, it was synchronization. Hundreds, then thousands, then millions of bodies had to show up at the same time, stand at the same machines, hit the same switches, catch the same trains. The clock became the boss, and the 8-hour workday movement, for all its genuine victories, finished the job. 8 hours for work, 8 for rest, 8 for what we will. Neat, symmetrical, and completely indifferent to the actual shape of human sleep. Artificial light, first candles and gas, then bulbs and screens, did the rest. You no longer had to go to bed soon after dark. You could push your evening forward, fill the old watch with newspapers, parlours, factories, clubs, radio, television, scrolling. The segmented night got squeezed. First sleep and second sleep gradually fused into one block to make room for longer evenings and early shifts. Waking up in the middle of the night went from a normal, expected part of the night to a diagnosis: insomnia. A quiet hour of reflection between two sleeps became something to medicate away. The real reason you aim for 8 continuous hours isn't that evolution sat down with a calculator and set the dial to exactly 480 minutes. Large population studies do show a sweet spot. Adults who report around 7 or 8 hours a night tend to have lower risks of heart disease, stroke, and early death than those who sleep much less or much more. But those curves are averages. They don't care whether your total comes in one chunk or two. They can't tell whether you're a natural night owl forced up at 6 or a lark stuck in a world of late shifts. What hardened 8 uninterrupted hours into a moral imperative was something else. Labour politics, electric light, time zones, school bells, and the momentum of a culture that fell in love with the clock. Your ancestors didn't count sleep by the hour. They read it off the body and the sky. So what does it mean to remember what they knew? It doesn't mean tossing your phone in a river and moving into a cave. It means quietly reclaiming the flexibility that is already built into your nervous system, and dropping some of the shame that industrial time wrapped around your pillow. It looks like this. If you wake up at 2:30 a.m. and feel strangely alert, you don't immediately panic that your life is ruined and tomorrow is destroyed. You recognize that for most of history, this kind of watch was normal. You keep the lights low. You don't blast yourself with blue screens. You read a few pages of something calm, or journal, or just lie there and let your thoughts wander. When sleepiness returns, you go back under. You've had a first sleep and a second sleep. Your brain has seen that pattern before. If your body starts sending you clear signals at 9:30 p.m. Heavy eyes, slowed thoughts. You don't treat that as weakness because your friends can stay up until 1. You let yourself be a lark. If you're most alive at 11 p.m., you acknowledge that you're closer to an owl. You can't always change your job or your school, but you can stop pretending that everyone's internal midnight is the same. Chronobiologists have a word for what happens when the social clock and the body clock don't match. Social jet lag. More than half of people live with at least an hour of it. Some live with 2 or 3. Your ancestors had jet lag too, caused by seasons, storms, migrations. The difference is that we now lock that mismatch in place, every day, for years. Remembering what they knew means asking hard questions about whether your schedule respects your chronotype at all. Can you slide your work window an hour later? Can you cluster early meetings on certain days and give your biology a break on others? Can you build a small legal siesta into your lunch? 20 minutes of real rest instead of caffeine and doom scrolling? And then there's the part we've almost completely lost. The quiet middle of the night that wasn't for productivity or entertainment, but for contemplation. Imagine that old watch between first and second sleep. No notifications, no deadlines, no performance. Just a shared, dimly lit interval where people whispered, prayed, made love, or sat alone with their thoughts. A built-in time for reflection, baked into the architecture of the night. Industrial sleep squeezed that out. Modern insomnia tries to reclaim it, but covered in anxiety and guilt. You probably can't bring back full medieval segmented sleep. But you can steal the principle. You can create a small protected watch on purpose, 10 minutes before bed with the lights low, no screens, nothing to accomplish. A ritual that tells your old nervous system, we remember the night is not just a gap between shifts. It's a place. We have lost the communal side of that too. The shared night. Whole villages whose rhythms bent together around fire and darkness. Families who knew each other's creaks on the floorboards at midnight. Watchmen whose job was to stay half awake so others could plunge fully under. Now, millions of us lie awake thinking we're the only one failing at sleep. But here's the twist your ancestors never had. They understood sleep from the inside. They knew it as an experience, a rhythm, a negotiation with weather and wolves and hunger. They did not know REM cycles, circadian periods, or the U-shaped mortality curve around 7 to 8 hours. They did not know about social jet lag, melatonin, or chronotypes. You do. You are the first generation in history that can see both the deep past and the internal machinery at the same time. You know that humans can adapt to naps on ships, siestas in hot climates, segmented winter nights, midnight nursing, teenage phase shifts. You know that the 8-hour block is a historical compromise, not a sacred law. You know that sleeping 5 hours a night for decades in the name of productivity quietly shreds attention, mood, and health, and that oversleeping can be a sign of illness, not virtue. For the first time, we have enough history to see how sleep has been bent by candles, clocks, and bosses, and enough science to see how far we can bend it back without breaking. Which means, for the first time, sleep is becoming something strange. A choice. Not in the sense that you can opt out. Your biology will always collect its debt one way or another. But in the sense that you don't have to accept the default shape handed down by factory whistles and fluorescent bulbs. You can decide that your nights will be governed less by shame and schedule, and more by signals from a body that remembers ice ages and oil lamps. You can treat the 8-hour rule not as a commandment, but as one option in a much older, wider repertoire. The question isn't, how do I force myself to sleep like a perfect factory worker? It's, now that I understand the story, evolution, history, clocks, disasters and all, how do I want to sleep? Because the next chapter of this story isn't going to be written by alarm companies or shift rosters. It's going to be written in your bedroom, one night at a time. And here's the quiet punchline the factories never planned for. When you see sleep as a story, not a sentence, something subtle shifts. Your night stops being a pass-fail test and starts looking more like those ancient patterns we've been tracing. Imperfect, adaptive, full of choices. Modern sleep science backs that up more than you might think. Health agencies talk about sleep behavior now, not sleep fate. They recommend at least 7 hours for most adults, not because everyone is stamped from the same mold, but because across millions of people, that's where the risks of heart disease, stroke and early death tend to be lowest. Not exactly 8 hours carved in stone, a range, a target you can approach from different angles. And experiments keep finding that even small shifts matter. One recent study had people add less than an extra hour of sleep a night, about 46 minutes. That's not some monk-like transformation. That's turning off one more episode or putting your phone down just a little earlier. But the effects were measurable. More resilience, more gratitude, more willingness to help other people, slightly kinder humans from slightly longer nights. In other words, you don't have to rebuild your entire life to rewrite your sleep story. Tiny edits count. It might look like protecting a regular bedtime more fiercely than a late-night scroll, or giving yourself 15 minutes of dim, quiet wind down instead of crashing from bright screens straight into bed, or experimenting with what actually calms your brain, reading, breathing exercises, a short gratitude list, because we have real evidence that nudging your thoughts in that direction can make it easier to fall asleep and feel better when you wake. None of it will be perfect. Some nights will still be clipped by work, kids, worry, or pain. Some seasons of life will make 7 straight hours feel like science fiction. That's okay. Human sleep has always been messy. But now you know that within that mess there's room to make choices that lean your biology in your favour, instead of always fighting it. So, wherever you are right now, on a night shift break, lying in bed in the dark, half asleep on a train, wide awake at 3 a.m, wondering what's wrong with you, you're holding a different story than you had an hour ago. You know that waking in the middle of the night doesn't automatically mean you're broken. It might just mean your nervous system is remembering an old pattern, a watch between first sleep and second sleep. You know that the 8-hour block is a historical compromise, not a law of nature. You know that enough sleep is a range you can explore, not a single magic number you've been failing to hit. And because of that, your next night is, in a small but real way, up to you. If this changed how you think about sleep, even a little, let me know. It helps more than you might realize. Like on this video, a tap on subscribe, that's the quiet fuel that lets me keep digging into the hidden histories underneath everyday life. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me where you're listening from, what time it is there, and whether you've ever had that strange middle-of-the-night wake-up. And if it feels a little different now that you've met first sleep and second sleep, share your own experiments. Naps, siestas, early bedtimes, late chronotypes trying to survive a morning world. The more perspectives we collect, the clearer this picture of human sleep becomes. If you want to go one step further and support the channel directly, there's a membership option on the page. Members make it possible to spend weeks chasing down studies, old diaries, and weird footnotes so I can turn them into episodes like this. But it's completely optional. Truly. Every view, every comment, every time you let one of these videos run while you drift off, that already helps enormously. However you choose to support, or just quietly watch from the dark corner of the internet, I'm grateful you spent this piece of the night here, because now, when you turn off the light, you carry a different sense of what that act means. You're not trying to obey a factory rule. You're participating in a living, flexible, 300,000-year-long negotiation between brains, bodies, and darkness. So tonight, when you close your eyes, remember, you're not just falling asleep. You're joining a ritual 300,000 years old. Sleep well, sleep wisely,